For most of human history, childhood as we imagine it today barely existed. A small human who could walk, carry, or observe was already slowly entering the world of work that kept the group alive. The long, protected years we now associate with childhood school, play, and gradual learning are a very recent condition in the story of our species. For tens of thousands of years, growing up often happened quietly and quickly, because survival rarely paused to make space for innocence. If that is true, a quiet question begins to appear in the background of human history. Why did most humans grow up without the childhood we now consider normal? And why might it be possible that 90% of human history had no childhood at all? For a modern listener, the word childhood often suggests a long, protected beginning to life. It brings to mind years that are set aside for learning, gradual growth, and a slow introduction to the wider world. Many societies today treat this period as a distinct stage of life, separated from adult responsibility by schools, social expectations, and cultural ideas about development. Yet when historians and anthropologists look across the much longer timeline of our species, this familiar structure begins to appear surprisingly recent. The human story stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, long before cities, classrooms, or written records existed. During most of that time, people lived in small mobile communities that depended directly on the surrounding landscape for survival. Within those environments, the boundaries between stages of life were often less clearly defined than they are today. Understanding this difference does not require imagining a completely different kind of humanity. The biological process of growing from infancy into adulthood has always been present in our species. Human children have always required long periods of care compared with most other animals, and our extended brain development is one of the defining features of human evolution. What changes across history is not the biology of growth itself, but the social meaning attached to different ages. In the modern world, the idea of childhood has become associated with protection, education, and the gradual transfer of responsibility. These expectations are supported by large institutions such as schools, legal systems, and organized economies. None of these structures existed during the vast majority of human history. Early human communities were usually small groups of hunter-gatherers who moved through landscapes following seasonal resources. Their daily lives were closely tied to weather, animals, plants, and the rhythms of the environment. In such settings, survival depended on shared knowledge and participation in everyday tasks. Anthropologists studying recent hunter-gatherer societies have often observed that learning happens through observation and gradual involvement rather than through formal instruction. Younger members of the group watch older individuals gather plants, prepare food, repair tools, and navigate the terrain. Over time, they begin to participate in simple ways, slowly building the practical understanding required to live within that environment. This process does not mean that young people immediately carried the same responsibilities as adults. Instead, it suggests that learning and participation were woven into daily life, rather than separated into a long protected stage. From a historical perspective, the modern idea of childhood begins to take clearer form much later, especially as societies grow larger and more complex. Agriculture, permanent settlements, and eventually cities created new social structures. Over many centuries, these developments allowed communities to support institutions that separated learning from work and extended the period before individuals were expected to contribute fully to adult roles. When historians describe childhood as a relatively recent concept, they are referring to this social separation between early life and adult responsibility. The biological stage of youth has always existed, but the cultural framework surrounding it has changed over time. Looking back toward the earliest chapters of human history therefore invites a quiet shift in perspective. The familiar pattern of childhood that shapes modern life may represent only a small portion of the long human timeline. For most of our species' existence, growing up unfolded within the shared rhythm of daily survival rather than within a clearly defined stage set apart from it. Somewhere far back along that timeline, before schools or formal institutions existed, the meaning of childhood was still closely tied to the environment in which human communities lived. When researchers step back and look across the long arc of human history, a striking contrast begins to appear. The structured childhood familiar in many modern societies is closely connected to institutions that emerged relatively late in the human story. Schools, formal apprenticeships, child labor laws, and systems of public education all shape the way childhood is understood today. These structures create a clear boundary between the early years of life and the responsibilities associated with adulthood. Yet, for most of the time that humans have existed, such systems had not yet developed. Early human communities lived without centralized institutions, without formal schooling, and without written records that defined age categories in the way modern societies do. In these environments, daily life was organized around the immediate needs of the group. Food had to be gathered or hunted, shelters maintained, tools repaired, and landscapes understood. Knowledge about the environment was not stored in books or classrooms, but carried in memory and shared through observation and participation. Anthropological research among many small-scale societies suggests that learning in these contexts often occurred through quiet exposure to everyday life. Young members of the community watched others work, listened to conversations, and slowly became familiar with the rhythms of their surroundings. Skills were not always introduced through formal lessons. Instead, they emerged gradually as individuals spent time within the activities that shaped the group's survival. This pattern of learning did not necessarily create a sharply separated stage called childhood. Instead, it reflected a more continuous process in which individuals moved step by step toward the knowledge required to live within their environment. Looking further back toward the origins of our species adds another layer to this perspective. Humans evolved in landscapes that demanded constant awareness of changing conditions. Weather patterns, seasonal migrations of animals, and the distribution of edible plants could all shape the movement of a community. Within such settings, knowledge of the environment was essential for everyone. The transmission of this knowledge was therefore woven into daily experience, rather than confined to a special period of life. A young person growing up within a mobile group might spend years simply observing how adults read tracks on the ground, recognize useful plants, or move safely through unfamiliar terrain. Over time, those observations slowly accumulated into practical understanding. From the viewpoint of evolutionary anthropology, this form of learning reflects a deep feature of human development. Our species is known for its capacity to acquire complex cultural knowledge across many years of life. Human childhood in a biological sense is unusually long compared with most other animals, largely because the human brain continues to develop and reorganize throughout early life. This extended developmental period allows individuals to absorb languages, social norms, and environmental knowledge from those around them. What varies across cultures and historical periods is the way societies organize that learning. In many modern settings, the process has been structured through schools and defined educational stages. In earlier times, learning was more closely integrated with the daily activities that sustained the community. Recognizing this distinction helps explain why historians sometimes describe the modern concept of childhood as a relatively recent development. The early years of life have always existed biologically, but the social framework that surrounds those years has changed across time. As we move further into the deeper past of our species, the environment itself becomes one of the most important influences shaping how young humans gradually became capable members of their communities. When the modern idea of childhood is placed beside the deeper timeline of human history, the difference becomes easier to see through the structure of daily life itself. In many contemporary societies, a child's early years are organized around spaces that are designed specifically for learning and development. Homes, schools, playgrounds, and educational systems create environments where young people spend long periods of time separated from the tasks that sustain the adult economy. This separation allows childhood to appear as a clearly defined stage with its own routines, expectations, and protections. Yet the environments in which early humans lived were very different from the landscapes of modern cities and institutions. For most of our species' existence, people lived in small groups that moved through forests, grasslands, river valleys, and coastal regions. Survival depended on close familiarity with these environments. Knowledge about water sources, seasonal plants, animal behavior, and safe travel routes formed the foundation of everyday life. Within such settings, learning did not occur inside specialized spaces designed only for the young. Instead, it unfolded within the same environments where adults carried out the activities necessary for survival. A young person growing up in a mobile human group would spend much of their time surrounded by the practical knowledge of the community. Fires were maintained, food was processed, shelters were assembled and taken down, and tools were crafted from stone, wood, bone, or plant fibers. These activities created a continuous flow of information about how the environment worked and how humans could live within it. Anthropologists often describe this kind of learning as observational participation. Younger members of the group gradually became familiar with the landscape and its resources by simply being present while daily life unfolded around them. Over long periods of time, the environment itself became a teacher. Footprints in soft ground might reveal the movement of animals. The smell of smoke could signal a distant campfire. The flowering of certain plants might indicate seasonal changes that shaped where people traveled next. None of these forms of knowledge required formal instruction in the modern sense, yet they demanded years of patient observation. In this way, growing up in early human communities often meant slowly absorbing the patterns of the natural world. This does not mean that early humans ignored the needs of their young. Biological care for infants and children has always been a central part of human life. Our species depends on long-term cooperation between adults to raise children successfully. Evidence from both anthropology and evolutionary biology suggests that caregiving networks involving parents, relatives, and other members of the group have been common throughout human history. These networks allowed young humans to survive the long developmental period required for the growth of the human brain. What appears different across time is the cultural framework surrounding that biological process. In modern societies, childhood is often treated as a separate domain protected from the adult world. In earlier environments, learning and development were more closely interwoven with the everyday activities that sustained the community. As a result, the boundary between childhood and adulthood could appear less sharply defined than it does today. Looking back across the long history of our species therefore reveals an important shift in perspective. The childhood familiar to many people today may represent only one particular way that human societies have organized the early years of life. Far earlier in the human story, growing up often unfolded within the same landscapes and routines that shaped the survival of the entire group. To understand why the early years of life may have looked different across most of human history, it helps to begin with the shape of human communities themselves. Modern societies often contain millions of people connected through large systems of agriculture, industry, and trade. Within such environments, it becomes possible for some members of society, especially children, to spend many years outside the immediate demands of survival. Food is produced at large scales, resources are stored, and institutions organize learning across long periods of time. The structure of life in early human communities was very different. For most of the time that humans have existed, people lived in relatively small groups that moved through landscapes in search of food and water. Anthropologists often describe these communities as hunter-gatherer groups, meaning that their survival depended on gathering plants, fishing, and hunting animals within the ecosystems around them. These groups were usually small compared with modern populations, often consisting of extended families or clusters of related households. Living in such environments created a social world in which daily life revolved around cooperation and shared knowledge. When historians examine these kinds of communities, one of the most noticeable features is their demographic structure. In many small populations living close to natural environments, the number of younger individuals tends to be relatively large compared with the number of older individuals. This pattern does not mean that people never reached older ages in the past. Archaeological and anthropological evidence shows that some individuals in ancient populations did live to advanced ages. However, the overall structure of the population was often shaped by environmental risks, disease, and the physical demands of life without modern medicine or infrastructure. As a result, communities often contained many young people and fewer individuals who had reached very old age. This demographic structure influenced how knowledge and experience were shared across generations. In a small mobile group, practical understanding of the landscape had to be transmitted constantly from those who already possessed it to those who were still learning. Knowledge about migration routes of animals, the locations of water sources, edible plants, and seasonal weather patterns could determine whether a group thrived or struggled. Because of this, learning about the environment was not postponed until a later stage of life. Instead, it unfolded gradually, as younger members of the community spent time observing the daily activities of older members. Within such communities, generations lived very closely together. Infants, young children, adolescents, and adults shared the same physical spaces as they traveled, gathered food, prepared tools, and maintained shelters, Fires burned at the center of camp life, providing warmth, light, and a place where stories and knowledge could be shared. Over long evenings near these fires, younger listeners could absorb information about animals, landscapes, and past journeys. In this way, the transfer of knowledge was deeply embedded in the social fabric of everyday life. When scholars speak about the absence of a clearly defined childhood across much of human history, they are often referring to this demographic and social arrangement. The early years of life were not separated from the rest of the community through specialized institutions. Instead, they unfolded within a network of relationships, where individuals gradually gained familiarity with the skills and knowledge needed to live in their environment. This perspective does not suggest that early humans viewed young people simply as small adults. Biological development has always shaped the pace at which individuals could participate in different activities. Physical strength, coordination, and cognitive maturity developed gradually across many years. What differed across history was not the process of growth itself, but the structure of society surrounding that growth. In early human communities, the pathway from infancy to adulthood was often integrated into the daily rhythm of life rather than organized into clearly separated stages. When we place this pattern within the much longer timeline of human evolution, a quiet realization begins to emerge. The modern expectation that childhood should form a long, protected stage of life may be connected to the relatively recent development of large, complex societies. Far earlier in the human story, the structure of small communities and the realities of living directly within natural landscapes shaped how each new generation gradually learned to become part of the human world. Looking more closely at the structure of early human populations reveals another quiet detail about life in small communities. Human groups that lived close to natural environments were shaped by patterns very different from those of modern societies. In the present world, advances in medicine, sanitation, and food production have allowed many people to live far longer lives than was typical in earlier periods of history. This has gradually created populations where several generations can exist together in large numbers. Grandparents, parents, and children may share many decades of overlapping life. In earlier human communities, the overall shape of the population was often different. Archaeological evidence from burial sites and skeletal remains suggests that many ancient populations contained a high proportion of younger individuals. Environmental pressures such as infectious disease, injuries, and the unpredictability of food supplies influenced how long people lived. This does not mean that older individuals were absent. Some people clearly did reach advanced ages and often played important roles in preserving knowledge about landscapes and traditions. Yet when the population of a community is relatively small, even a few unexpected deaths can significantly affect the age structure of the group. The result is a social environment where many members are young and where the process of learning from older individuals is especially important. This demographic pattern shaped the rhythm of everyday life. Knowledge about survival could not be stored in written records or external systems. It had to be carried in memory and passed directly from person to person. When a group moved across a landscape, the location of water sources, safe routes through difficult terrain, and the seasonal behavior of animals were all part of a shared mental map held by experienced members of the community. For younger individuals growing up within such groups, simply being present during daily activities allowed them to gradually absorb this information. The landscape itself served as a living archive of knowledge. Over time, younger members of the community would begin to recognize familiar patterns. The color of plants might indicate changing seasons. The calls of certain birds might signal the presence of animals nearby. Subtle changes in the wind or temperature might hint at approaching weather. These forms of awareness were not learned through written instruction but through years of attentive observation within the environment where people lived. Because communities were small, the distance between generations was often physically and socially close. Children spent much of their time near adults who were preparing food, maintaining tools, or discussing travel plans. This proximity meant that learning could happen quietly and continuously. A young observer might watch how a tool was shaped from stone, how animal tracks were interpreted, or how plants were processed for food. Over many seasons, these repeated observations formed a foundation of practical understanding. Anthropologists sometimes describe this pattern as learning through participation in a shared world rather than through structured teaching. Within such environments, knowledge was not organized into subjects or lessons. Instead, it was woven into the movements of daily life. Preparing food, building temporary shelters, or moving camp from one valley to another all contained small fragments of information about the environment and the community's place within it. As a result, the process of growing up could unfold within the same spaces where the entire group lived and worked. When historians consider these demographic and environmental conditions together, they begin to see why the idea of childhood as a long protected stage may not have taken the same form across most of human history. The structure of small populations, the closeness of generations, and the need to transmit practical knowledge all encouraged a form of learning that was integrated into everyday life. Long before the appearance of schools or formal institutions, human communities were already sharing the knowledge required for survival through the quiet continuity of daily experience. When the structure of early human populations is viewed from a wider historical perspective, another pattern slowly comes into focus. Small communities living close to natural environments often depended on a delicate balance between resources, mobility, and cooperation. Groups had to remain flexible, moving when local food supplies changed or when seasonal conditions shifted. In such settings, survival was rarely the result of one individual's effort alone. It depended on the combined awareness and skills of the entire group. Because of this, knowledge was one of the most valuable resources a community possessed. Information about landscapes, animal behavior, and seasonal cycles allowed people to move safely through environments that could otherwise be unpredictable. Yet this knowledge could not exist in isolation within a single generation. For a community to endure over time, it had to be passed continuously from older individuals to younger ones. In the absence of writing or permanent records, memory and shared experience formed the primary pathways through which knowledge traveled. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human communities often maintained traditions for tool-making, food preparation, and travel routes across many generations. Stone tools discovered in different regions sometimes show similar manufacturing techniques repeated across long stretches of time. This continuity implies that practical skills were transmitted carefully within communities. Younger individuals likely learned these techniques gradually by watching experienced toolmakers shape stone, bone, or wood into useful objects. Through repeated exposure, they would become familiar with the rhythm of the work and the properties of different materials. Over time, this quiet learning allowed knowledge to move from one generation to the next without the need for written instruction. The same pattern likely applied to other forms of knowledge that shaped daily survival. Recognizing animal tracks, understanding the behavior of certain plants, and knowing how to move through unfamiliar terrain required years of accumulated experience. Such understanding could not be developed quickly. It emerged slowly through observation, imitation, and participation in the shared life of the community. Because small groups often lived closely together, younger members were surrounded by these forms of knowledge from an early age. The sounds of tool-making, the preparation of food, the stories told around evening fires, and the discussions about future travel routes all formed part of a continuous learning environment. Within this environment, growing up meant gradually becoming familiar with the many layers of knowledge required to live within the surrounding landscape. The boundary between learning and daily life was therefore much less visible than it is in modern societies. Instead of being organized into a separate stage, the acquisition of knowledge unfolded through everyday experience. Looking back toward the origins of our species adds another dimension to this pattern. Human evolution produced a brain capable of storing and transmitting large amounts of cultural knowledge. This ability allowed early communities to adapt to many different environments across the planet. But such adaptability also required time. Younger individuals needed years to absorb languages, social norms, and practical skills from the people around them. In this sense, human development has always depended on a long period of learning. What differed across most of history was the social framework surrounding that learning. Rather than being structured through institutions like schools, knowledge was embedded within the movements of the group itself. Each generation inherited an understanding of the landscape that had been shaped by countless previous journeys. Through observation and participation, younger individuals slowly became part of that long chain of memory that connected human communities across time. To understand how the earliest human environments shaped the experience of growing up, it helps to imagine the landscapes in which our species spent most of its history. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived within ecosystems where survival depended directly on the natural world. Forests, Open grasslands, river valleys, coastal shores, and seasonal wetlands formed the settings in which communities moved and lived. Unlike modern cities, these landscapes did not provide layers of infrastructure designed to buffer daily life from environmental change. Weather patterns, the migration of animals, the availability of water, and the cycles of plant growth all shaped where people traveled and how they organized their camps. Living within such environments required careful attention to the rhythms of nature. A group might follow the seasonal movement of animals across wide territories or return repeatedly to certain valleys where edible plants were known to grow. Knowledge of these patterns accumulated gradually through long experience. When older members of the community remembered where certain resources appeared each year, those memories helped guide the decisions of the group. Over time, these shared memories formed an invisible map of the landscape that existed only within human understanding. In this context, the environment itself played a powerful role in shaping the process of growing up. A young person living in a mobile community would encounter the landscape not as a distant background, but as a constant presence. The sound of wind moving through tall grass, the changing color of leaves through the seasons, and the shifting position of the sun across the sky all carried practical meaning for people who depended on these signals. Learning to recognize these patterns required time and repeated exposure. Because daily survival depended on understanding the environment, knowledge about the landscape was rarely separated from the ordinary routines of life. Fires had to be maintained for warmth and cooking. Water sources had to be located and remembered. Paths through mountains, forests, or open plains had to be known in order to move safely from place to place. Within such a world, the boundary between learning and living was almost invisible. Younger members of the community gradually encountered the knowledge necessary for survival, simply by sharing the same environment as older members. A walk across a valley might reveal animal tracks pressed into the soil. A gathering trip might show how certain plants were identified and collected. Even the placement of camp could contain important information about wind direction, shelter, or access to water. Each of these moments formed small fragments of understanding about how the environment worked. Anthropologists who study societies living close to natural landscapes often describe this process as environmental learning. Knowledge emerges not only from direct instruction but from long familiarity with a place. Over many seasons, the landscape becomes recognizable in increasingly subtle ways. Small changes in temperature, the calls of particular animals, or the flowering of certain plants may signal shifts in weather or resource availability. For someone growing up within such surroundings, these signals gradually form part of everyday awareness. When this environmental perspective is placed beside the idea of childhood as it exists in many modern societies, an important contrast appears. Today, much of childhood takes place within environments designed specifically for young people. Schools, homes, and urban spaces often separate learning from the immediate pressures of survival. Early human communities lived in settings where such separation rarely existed. The natural world itself formed the setting in which people learned how to live. Within that setting, growing up meant slowly becoming familiar with the rhythms of the landscape that sustained the entire community. In landscapes where early human communities lived, the environment was not simply a setting in the background of life. It was an active force shaping how people moved, what they ate, and how knowledge was shared across generations. Unlike the built environments of modern societies, these landscapes changed constantly through natural cycles. Seasons altered the availability of food. Rivers shifted their flow. Herds of animals migrated across wide territories. Storms, droughts, and temperature changes could reshape the possibilities of a region from one year to the next. Human groups living within such environments had to develop a close awareness of these rhythms in order to survive. This awareness was rarely contained within formal systems of teaching. Instead, it emerged slowly through repeated encounters with the same landscapes over many seasons. When a community returned to a familiar valley year after year, the land itself carried memories of earlier journeys. Certain areas might be known for the presence of edible plants during specific months. Other locations might be remembered as places where animals frequently passed during migration. Even the shape of hills or the direction of prevailing winds could influence where camps were placed and how people traveled. For individuals growing up in such settings, learning about the environment unfolded through long exposure to these patterns. The knowledge required to live in a place was embedded in the landscape itself. A young observer might notice how experienced members of the community paused to examine the ground while walking, reading subtle marks left by animals or earlier travelers. A simple change in the arrangement of stones or broken branches might signal that someone had passed through the area recently. These details formed a language of the landscape that gradually became recognizable through practice and familiarity. Over time, younger members of the group would begin to understand how the environment communicated information about movement, weather, and the presence of resources. Anthropological studies of communities living close to natural environments today often describe a similar process of learning. Knowledge of landscapes is not usually acquired in a single moment of instruction. It develops gradually through years of attention and participation in daily life. People become familiar with the subtle characteristics of places they visit repeatedly. A particular bend in a river may become associated with certain fish during a specific season. A ridge overlooking a valley may offer clues about approaching weather. Even the sounds carried by wind across open land can reveal information about nearby animals or distant activity. For early human communities, this kind of environmental knowledge was not an abstract form of education. It was a practical skill directly linked to survival. Recognizing where water could be found during dry seasons or identifying plants that were safe to eat could make a profound difference for a small group moving through unfamiliar territory. Because this information was essential for the well-being of the entire community, it was shared constantly through everyday experience. As younger individuals spent time within these landscapes, they slowly became familiar with the same signals that guided the movements of the group. In this way, the environment itself helped shape how each generation learned about the world. Instead of separating learning into a distinct stage of life, the natural setting of early human communities created a continuous process of discovery that unfolded over many years. Growing up meant gradually recognizing how landscapes, seasons, and living creatures were connected within the broader rhythms of the natural world that humans depended on for survival. Across the long history of human evolution, the relationship between people and their environments shaped not only survival but also the pace at which knowledge was absorbed by each new generation. Landscapes were not static backdrops but dynamic systems that changed gradually through cycles of climate, vegetation, and animal movement. Human communities had to learn how to live within these systems, adjusting their routes and habits as conditions shifted. Over thousands of years, this relationship produced a deep familiarity with the natural world that guided how groups moved across territories and how individuals learned to interpret their surroundings. For younger members of a community, the environment itself became a constant presence during the process of growing up. Camps were often placed near reliable water sources, sheltered areas, or locations that provided access to food. From these camps, people moved outward each day to gather plants, search for animals, or explore nearby terrain. As individuals walked through these landscapes repeatedly, the features of the land slowly became recognizable. A certain grove of trees might indicate fertile soil. A rocky slope might reveal where animals traveled through narrow passes. The curve of a river might signal where fish could be found during particular seasons. None of this information existed in written form. Instead, it lived within the collective memory of the group, passed quietly from one generation to the next through shared experience. The process of learning these patterns was gradual. Younger individuals often accompanied adults during everyday activities, observing how experienced members of the community responded to the environment. They might watch how someone paused to study the ground for animal tracks, or how another person tested the firmness of soil before crossing a stream. These small moments contained practical knowledge about the landscape. Over many seasons, repeated exposure to such moments allowed younger observers to build their own understanding of the environment. Anthropologists sometimes describe this as place-based knowledge, meaning that learning is deeply tied to the physical locations where people live and move. Each valley, riverbank, or forest clearing holds a collection of experiences accumulated over time. The memory of these experiences becomes part of the group's shared understanding of the land. In early human communities, this kind of knowledge was essential for navigating large territories safely. When a group returned to a familiar region after months or years away, subtle details in the landscape could help confirm where they were and what resources might be available. In this context, the environment shaped the rhythm of human development. Learning to read landscapes required patience and attention rather than rapid instruction. Recognizing the meaning of animal tracks or the seasonal appearance of certain plants could take many years of observation. Because these lessons were embedded in the ordinary movements of daily life, they were not confined to a specific period labeled as education. Instead, they formed a continuous background to the experience of growing up. This perspective helps explain why the idea of childhood as a clearly separated stage may not have appeared in the same way throughout most of human history. Early human communities lived within environments where knowledge and survival were closely connected. As each new generation grew within those landscapes, they gradually became familiar with the same patterns that had guided their ancestors. The land itself, with its repeating seasons and shifting signals, served as both classroom and archive for the long human journey through time. Human biology carries its own quiet record of how our species developed across deep time. Long before cities, agriculture, or written language appeared, the human body had already evolved distinctive patterns of growth. One of the most unusual features of our species is the length of time it takes for a human brain to fully develop. Compared with many other animals, humans are born relatively early in their neurological development. Much of the brain's growth continues after birth, unfolding gradually through childhood and adolescence. This extended development is closely connected to the complexity of human culture. The human brain must learn language, social rules, environmental knowledge, and a wide range of practical skills. Such learning cannot occur instantly. It requires years of observation, imitation, and gradual understanding. In evolutionary terms, this long period of development has often been described as one of the defining traits of the human species. Scientists studying human evolution frequently point out that humans have one of the longest juvenile periods among mammals. This extended phase allows the brain to remain flexible while individuals absorb information from the social world around them. Yet this biological reality creates an interesting contrast when placed beside the structure of human history. The human body evolved to support a long developmental period, but the social environments in which humans lived for most of their history did not always organize that period into a clearly separated stage of life. In many modern societies, childhood is marked by institutions that structure learning across many years. Schools provide formal education, legal systems define age categories, and social expectations delay adult responsibilities. These systems create a visible boundary between childhood and adulthood. When researchers look further back in time, however, the cultural framework surrounding early life appears less clearly divided. The biological process of growing and learning remained the same, but the social structure around it looked different. Early human communities did not have institutions dedicated solely to education. Instead, the process of learning was embedded in everyday life. A child's brain was still developing, still absorbing information about language, relationships, and the environment. The difference was that this learning occurred through direct participation in the world around them, rather than through specialized systems designed for instruction. This biological perspective introduces an important paradox at the center of the human story. On one hand, the human species evolved a long period of development that supports learning and adaptation. On the other hand, the societies in which humans lived for most of history did not always create a distinct social category that separated children from the wider activities of the community. The human brain required time to learn, yet the structure of life often integrated that learning into the shared routines of survival. Anthropologists sometimes describe this as a difference between biological childhood and social childhood. Biological childhood refers to the developmental period shaped by human physiology and brain growth. Social childhood refers to the cultural framework that societies create around that stage of life. Across the long timeline of human history, biological childhood has remained constant, while social childhood has changed in response to different environments and forms of social organization. Understanding this distinction helps clarify why historians sometimes say that childhood, as it is commonly understood today, is a relatively recent development. The early years of human life have always existed in biological terms. What has changed across history is the way societies interpret, structure, and protect those years. When we return to the deeper origins of our species, we begin to see that the long developmental pathway of the human brain evolved in environments very different from the institutional settings that shape childhood in the modern world. When scientists study the development of the human body, they often notice a pattern that appears unusual when compared with most other animals. Many species grow quickly after birth and reach physical maturity within a relatively short time. In contrast, humans follow a much slower developmental path. The brain continues to grow and reorganize for many years, and the skills required to function fully within a human community are learned gradually across a long stretch of early life. This extended period of development is closely connected to the complexity of human social life. Humans do not rely only on instinctive behaviors to survive. Instead, much of what people need to know about the world must be learned from others. Languages, traditions, social relationships, and practical knowledge about the environment are all part of a cultural system that exists outside the body. Each generation inherits this system not through genetics, but through learning. Because human societies depend so heavily on shared knowledge, the brain must remain flexible for a long time during development. This flexibility allows young humans to absorb information from the social and physical environments around them. In evolutionary biology, this prolonged period of learning is sometimes discussed as part of what makes human culture possible. Over thousands of generations, the ability to acquire knowledge from others allowed human communities to adapt to many different environments across the planet. Groups moved into forests, deserts, mountains, and coastal regions, developing specialized ways of living within each landscape. These adaptations were not written into human DNA, but passed from person to person through teaching, observation, and imitation. As a result, the early years of human life became a time when individuals gradually learned the knowledge needed to live within their particular community. Yet when we look at how early human societies were organized, we see that this biological capacity for long learning did not always lead to a clearly separated stage of childhood. Instead, the process of acquiring knowledge was woven directly into the activities that sustained the group. The human brain may have required years to absorb complex cultural information, but the structure of daily life often allowed that learning to occur while individuals were already present within the shared routines of the community. From an evolutionary perspective, this arrangement may have been both practical and efficient. In small communities living close to natural environments, separating younger individuals from the rest of the group would have been difficult. Camps were small, resources limited, and mobility often necessary. Under these conditions, knowledge about the world had to be transmitted in ways that fit naturally within everyday life. Observation, imitation, and gradual participation provided a pathway through which younger individuals could learn without the need for specialized institutions. Anthropologists studying learning in small-scale societies frequently describe this pattern as distributed learning. Instead of taking place in a single location or through formal instruction, knowledge emerges through many small interactions across the community. A young person may learn about plants while accompanying someone on a gathering trip, observe how tools are repaired near the fire, and hear stories about past journeys during evening conversations. Each of these moments contributes to a growing understanding of the world. Over time, the brain organizes these fragments into a larger network of knowledge. This process reflects the remarkable adaptability of the human mind. Our species evolved a brain capable of absorbing information across long periods of development, and early human communities created social environments where that learning could unfold naturally within daily life. When we look back across the deep history of our species, we begin to see that the biological capacity for long childhood did not automatically produce the social structure of childhood familiar today. Instead, the relationship between human biology and social organization created many different ways for young humans to grow into their roles within the community. The long development of the human brain creates another quiet feature of human life that becomes clearer when we look across the deep timeline of our species. Humans are not born with a complete set of behaviors that guide survival automatically. Instead, much of what people must know about the world is learned gradually through interaction with others and through experience in the environment. This reliance on learning is one of the reasons the human brain continues to develop for so many years after birth. During early life, the brain forms new connections at a remarkable pace. Neural pathways strengthen as individuals encounter language, observe social interactions, and gain familiarity with the physical world around them. Scientists often describe this stage as a period of heightened plasticity, meaning the brain is especially capable of adapting to new information. This flexibility allows young humans to absorb complex systems of knowledge that have accumulated across generations. Languages, traditions, and practical skills are not stored in the body at birth. They exist within communities and must be learned through participation in shared life. When this biological process is considered alongside the environments in which early humans lived, an interesting pattern emerges. Small mobile communities offered constant exposure to the kinds of information the developing brain needed to organize. Sounds of conversation provided language. The presence of older individuals demonstrated social behavior. Daily movement across landscapes revealed how people navigated their surroundings. Instead of isolating learning into a separate period or specialized place, early human life allowed these forms of knowledge to appear continuously within the ordinary flow of activities. Over time, the brain gradually organized these repeated experiences into understanding. A young person hearing conversations within the group would slowly become familiar with the rhythms and meanings of language. Observing the preparation of food might reveal which plants were edible and how they were processed. Watching experienced travelers move through the landscape could demonstrate how to recognize safe routes or avoid hazards. None of these lessons required formal explanation in every instance. The developing brain is particularly skilled at detecting patterns. Through repeated exposure, it begins to recognize relationships between actions and outcomes. This ability to learn through observation is shared with many animals, yet in humans it is supported by a brain capable of storing large amounts of cultural information. Anthropologists often note that human societies depend on this cultural transmission. Knowledge is accumulated over many generations, and each new generation must learn what previous generations have discovered. The extended developmental period of the human brain provides the time needed for this transfer to occur. Yet the structure of learning does not always look the same across different societies. In modern industrial societies, education is often organized through institutions that separate learning from other parts of life. Children attend schools, follow structured lessons, and gradually prepare for adult roles through formal training. In earlier human communities, the pathway to learning was more closely connected to everyday experience. The brain still required many years to absorb knowledge, but the environment in which that learning happened was integrated into the shared life of the group. Recognizing this relationship between biology and social structure helps clarify the unusual position of childhood in the human story. The biological foundations for a long period of development were present throughout human evolution. What changed across time was the cultural framework that surrounded those years. As societies grew larger and more complex, new institutions gradually emerged to organize learning in different ways. Far earlier in the history of our species, the developing human brain encountered knowledge directly within the landscapes and communities where people lived. Growing up meant slowly weaving together countless small experiences into a practical understanding of the world. Long before the existence of classrooms or written lessons, human communities had already developed ways of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The survival of small groups depended on this transfer of understanding. Skills related to finding food, recognizing landscapes, maintaining tools, and navigating social relationships were essential for daily life. Because these skills could not be inherited biologically, they had to be learned through interaction with other members of the community. In early human societies, learning was closely connected to the shared rhythm of everyday activities. People did not step out of ordinary life in order to learn. Instead, knowledge was encountered while daily tasks unfolded around them. A group might spend part of the day gathering plants, repairing tools, or traveling across familiar territory. During these moments, younger individuals were often present within the same spaces where knowledge was being practiced. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies frequently describe this pattern as learning through observation and gradual involvement. In such environments, people rarely relied on formal lessons separated from daily life. Instead, learning emerged through repeated exposure to the same activities carried out by more experienced members of the community. A young observer might watch someone carefully shape a stone tool, noticing how pressure was applied to create a sharp edge. Over time, these observations could slowly build familiarity with the techniques involved. The same process could occur during food preparation, travel across landscapes, or the construction of temporary shelters. This form of learning did not necessarily require constant verbal explanation. Human beings are particularly skilled at recognizing patterns through observation. When the brain repeatedly encounters the same actions within similar contexts, it begins to detect relationships between those actions and their outcomes. Gradually, these patterns become part of a person's understanding of how the world works. In communities where survival depended on practical knowledge, this kind of observational learning allowed younger individuals to absorb complex information over many years. Another important feature of this process was the shared nature of community life. Early human camps were often small, and many daily activities took place in open spaces where several members of the group could see and hear what others were doing. Preparing food near a fire, repairing hunting tools, or discussing travel routes might happen within view of the entire camp. This created an environment where information moved naturally between generations. Younger individuals could hear conversations about the landscape, about weather changes, or about decisions regarding where the group would move next. Over time, these conversations formed part of the background knowledge that helped individuals understand how the community interacted with its environment. Stories may also have played an important role in transmitting knowledge. Many anthropologists believe that oral traditions help preserve information about landscapes, animals, and past experiences. Around evening fires, members of the community could share accounts of earlier journeys, encounters with animals, or unusual environmental events. These stories did more than entertain. They helped maintain a collective memory that guided the group's decisions in the future. For younger listeners, such stories offered another pathway for learning about the world beyond their immediate experience. When historians consider how learning occurred before the rise of formal education, they often emphasize the flexibility of these systems. Knowledge was not contained in books or institutions, but carried within people and within the relationships that connected them. This meant that learning could happen at many different moments throughout daily life. Over many seasons, younger members of the community gradually assembled the practical knowledge required to live within their environment. In this way, the early human world functioned as a continuous learning environment, where knowledge flowed quietly through the shared experiences of the group. When anthropologists observe communities that still live close to natural environments, today, they sometimes notice a pattern that may resemble how learning occurred for much of human history. Knowledge is rarely confined to a single place or moment. Instead, it appears gradually through many small interactions spread across everyday life. People move through the landscape together, share meals, repair tools, and discuss the events of the day. Within these ordinary moments, practical understanding slowly accumulates. A person may learn how to recognize useful plants while accompanying others during gathering trips. Another skill might appear while watching someone prepare food or mend equipment near the fire. None of these situations require a formal classroom. Instead, the environment of daily life itself becomes the setting where knowledge is encountered again and again. Over long periods of time, repeated exposure allows individuals to recognize patterns and relationships between actions and outcomes. This pattern of learning can be described as gradual participation. Younger members of a community often begin by observing the activities of others. They watch how experienced individuals move through the environment, how tools are handled, and how decisions are made when the group faces changing conditions. At first, their role may be limited to observation, yet as familiarity grows, they may begin to take part in simple ways. Someone might help carry gathered plants back to camp, assist in preparing materials, or accompany others on short journeys through familiar terrain. Through these small steps, participation slowly expands as understanding deepens. This process does not happen quickly. Learning how to interpret landscapes, recognize plants, or understand social expectations requires many seasons of experience. The advantage of gradual participation is that knowledge becomes closely tied to the contexts in which it is used. Instead of memorizing abstract instructions, individuals learn by encountering real situations where knowledge has practical meaning. Over time, these experiences form a network of understanding that guides future actions. Another important feature of this learning environment is the role of social relationships. In small communities, individuals spend much of their time in the presence of others. Conversations about the day's events, discussions about weather patterns, or decisions about where the group might travel next often occur within earshot of many members of the camp. Younger listeners may not fully understand every detail at first, But repeated exposure to these discussions gradually reveals how the community interprets the world around it. Through listening and observation, individuals begin to recognize the connections between environmental signals, group decisions, and the outcomes that follow. Stories may also serve as another pathway through which knowledge travels. In many oral cultures, storytelling carries information about landscapes, animals, and past experiences that remain relevant to the community. A story about a difficult journey through a certain valley might contain subtle warnings about seasonal flooding or dangerous terrain. Accounts of encounters with animals might help listeners remember how those animals behave under particular conditions. These stories are not simply entertainment. They act as a form of memory that allows communities to preserve knowledge across generations. When people gather during quiet moments of the day or around evening fires, these narratives can pass important information to younger listeners who will one day face similar situations. Looking across the deeper history of our species, this kind of learning environment likely shaped how many generations gradually came to understand their world. Knowledge was not confined to special buildings or limited periods of life. Instead, it flowed continuously through the shared experiences of the community. Each activity, conversation, and story contributed small pieces to a growing understanding of the environment and of the social relationships that allowed human groups to endure across time. When learning is closely connected to everyday life, knowledge moves quietly through the rhythms of the community rather than through formal lessons. In many early human settings, the environment of the camp itself created a natural flow of information between generations. Activities that were essential for survival often took place in shared spaces where several members of the group could see and hear what others were doing. Preparing food, shaping tools, maintaining fires, and discussing travel routes were not hidden processes. They unfolded in the open, allowing younger observers to become familiar with them long before they attempted the tasks themselves. This constant proximity created a form of learning that depended less on instruction and more on attention. The human brain is particularly skilled at noticing patterns in repeated actions. When someone sees the same sequence of movements many times, those movements gradually become understandable even without detailed explanation. Over time, the hands that once only watched may begin to imitate simple steps of the process. A young person observing the preparation of plant foods might begin by helping sort leaves or carry baskets. Later, they might learn how certain plants were identified or how they were processed for eating. The transition from observation to participation was often gradual, unfolding through small acts of involvement rather than through a clearly marked moment when learning officially began. The structure of early camps also meant that knowledge was rarely held by a single individual. Many members of the community possessed different kinds of experience shaped by their journeys and interactions with the landscape. Some individuals might be especially familiar with certain plants or water sources. Others might have long experienced traveling across particular valleys or mountain passes. Conversations within the group allowed these different forms of knowledge to circulate. When people discussed where to move next or what resources might be available in a nearby region, they shared fragments of understanding drawn from memory and observation. Younger listeners hearing these conversations could gradually piece together a mental map of the world beyond their immediate experience. Another quiet source of learning emerged during moments when the pace of activity slowed. In the evening, after the tasks of the day were finished, communities often gathered near fires for warmth and conversation. The light of the fire extended the day just enough for people to talk about past journeys, unusual events, or places remembered from earlier seasons. These stories often contained practical details about landscapes and animals, even when they were told in a narrative form. A story describing a difficult crossing of a river might also reveal where safe passage could usually be found. An account of an encounter with animals might carry subtle information about how those animals behave during certain times of year. Through repeated storytelling, these details became part of the shared memory of the group. For younger listeners, stories offered a way to encounter knowledge that extended beyond their own direct experience. They could imagine places they had not yet visited or situations they had not yet faced. Over time, these narratives helped prepare them for the moments when they would eventually travel those same routes or recognize similar patterns in the environment. Anthropologists often describe this process as cultural transmission, meaning the gradual movement of knowledge across generations through interaction, observation, and shared memory. In communities where writing did not yet exist, such transmission formed the foundation of continuity. Each generation inherited a world shaped by the experiences of those who came before. Learning how to live within that world did not depend on a formal system of education. Instead, it unfolded through the countless small moments of attention, conversation, and shared activity that connected individuals to the knowledge carried by their community. When researchers attempt to understand how young humans lived in the distant past, they face a quiet challenge. The earliest chapters of human history left no written records. There are no diaries, no descriptions of daily life, and no direct explanations of how communities organized the early years of life. Instead, much of what we know about ancient human societies comes from fragments preserved in the ground. Archaeology studies these fragments carefully, examining bones, tools, campsites, and other traces left behind by people who lived thousands of years ago. Through these remains, scientists try to reconstruct the structure of past communities. Although the evidence is often incomplete, certain patterns appear repeatedly across many archaeological sites. One of the most important sources of information comes from human skeletal remains discovered in burial grounds or ancient settlements. By examining bones and teeth, researchers can estimate the approximate age of individuals at the time of death. Teeth are especially useful for this purpose because they develop in predictable stages throughout childhood and adolescence. By studying the wear patterns and growth stages of teeth, scientists can often distinguish between infants, young children, adolescents, and adults within ancient populations. When archaeologists analyze groups of skeletons from the same site, they sometimes gain a rough picture of the community's age structure. This does not reveal the personal stories of the individuals who lived there, but it can show how many members of the group were young, how many were adults, and how many reached older ages. Such patterns help researchers understand how generations were distributed within ancient populations. In some cases, the archaeological record suggests that many communities included a significant number of younger individuals. This observation aligns with what scientists know about populations living without modern medicine, where disease, injuries, and environmental challenges could influence how long people lived. Another type of evidence appears in the tools and objects discovered at archaeological sites. Stone tools are among the most common artifacts preserved from early human history because stone survives long after organic materials have disappeared. These tools sometimes vary in size and complexity. Some archaeologists have noted that smaller or less refined tools occasionally appear alongside more carefully shaped ones. While such differences do not automatically reveal who made them, they may reflect stages of learning within a community. Tool-making is a skill that requires practice and careful control of pressure when shaping stone. The presence of tools with varying levels of precision may suggest that individuals with different degrees of experience were involved in the process. Archaeological sites also sometimes preserve traces of ancient camps or activity areas where people prepared food, worked on tools, or maintained fires. The arrangement of these spaces can reveal how communities organized daily life. Certain areas might contain the remains of repeated tool-making, while others show evidence of food preparation or animal processing. When these areas appear close together, they suggest that many activities occurred within shared spaces rather than in isolated locations. This arrangement would have allowed members of the community to observe each other's work easily. Younger individuals present within such camps could see the processes through which tools were made, food was prepared, and decisions were discussed. Archaeology cannot show every detail of how people lived, but it provides glimpses of the environments where learning and daily life unfolded. From scattered bones, stone tools, and traces of campsites, researchers begin to assemble a picture of communities where generations lived closely together and where practical knowledge was carried in the activities of everyday survival. Archaeology sometimes reveals another quiet kind of evidence that helps researchers understand how people lived together in the distant past. Beyond bones and tools, the ground occasionally preserves traces of movement itself. In rare conditions where soil hardened quickly or sediment settled gently over soft ground, impressions left by human feet have remained visible for thousands of years. These ancient footprints do not tell stories in words, yet they offer something equally valuable, a direct glimpse of how people once moved through a landscape. One of the most well-known examples of such evidence comes from preserved trackways discovered in ancient sediment layers. When scientists study these footprints carefully, they can sometimes estimate the approximate size of the individuals who made them. Larger prints suggest adult travelers, while smaller prints may belong to younger members of the group. When several different sizes appear together within the same trackway, it suggests that individuals of different ages moved across the same landscape at the same time. These discoveries provide a rare moment where the archaeological record captures human movement almost as if it had happened yesterday. A group once walked across soft ground, leaving temporary marks that later hardened and remained hidden until researchers uncovered them many thousands of years later. Although these footprints cannot reveal the personal experiences of those individuals, they demonstrate that ancient human groups often traveled as mixed-age communities rather than as isolated adults. In some preserved trackways, smaller footprints appear alongside larger ones in ways that suggest shared movement across the same terrain. Such findings remind researchers that younger individuals were likely present during many ordinary activities of daily life. Traveling across landscapes, visiting water sources, or moving between camps would have involved multiple members of the community moving together. The environment through which they walked, therefore, became part of the experience of growing up. Each journey exposed individuals to the terrain, plants, animals, and weather patterns that shaped life in that region. Footprints are not the only traces of movement that archaeologists sometimes encounter. In certain locations, layers of sediment preserve repeated paths created by many journeys over time. These pathways suggest routes that communities return to again and again as they move through familiar territories. While the precise individuals who walked these paths cannot be identified, the repeated patterns of travel hint at a shared understanding of the landscape. Paths often connected water sources, food-rich areas, and safe places for temporary camps. Younger members of the community traveling these same routes would gradually become familiar with the geography of their surroundings. Archaeologists also examine how activity areas within camps are arranged. The remains of hearths, tool-making debris, and food processing sometimes appear within close proximity to one another. This arrangement suggests that many tasks took place in shared spaces rather than in isolated locations. When people prepared food, shaped tools, or discussed plans for travel, others within the camp could easily observe what was happening nearby. Such spatial arrangements may have created natural opportunities for learning through observation. Younger individuals present within these shared spaces would have seen the techniques and decisions that shape daily survival. Each moment of observation could add another fragment to their understanding of how the community interacted with the environment. Although archaeology rarely reveals the full details of everyday life, these traces of movement and shared activity provide subtle clues about how generations lived together. Footprints crossing ancient mud, pathways worn through repeated travel, and camps organized around common spaces all suggest communities where knowledge and experience were visible parts of daily life. Through these quiet fragments preserved in the earth, researchers gain a glimpse of how human groups once moved through the world as interconnected generations, learning the landscapes around them. Archaeological evidence becomes even more meaningful when different kinds of traces are examined together. Bones, tools, footprints, and camp remains rarely tell a complete story on their own. Yet when researchers compare these fragments across many different sites, patterns begin to appear that help illuminate how human communities once lived. These patterns suggest environments where daily activities unfolded within shared spaces and where generations were often present together during the ordinary routines of life. One important source of insight comes from the distribution of objects within ancient camps. When archaeologists excavate a site, they carefully map the locations of tools, animal bones, hearths, and other materials found in the soil. These patterns sometimes reveal distinct areas where certain activities occurred repeatedly. For example, clusters of stone flakes may indicate places where people shaped tools from raw stone. Nearby areas might contain animal bones that were cut or broken during food preparation. Hearths mark places where fires burned, providing warmth and a place for cooking and conversation. When these areas appear close together, they suggest that many daily tasks happened within a shared environment rather than being separated into distant spaces. Such arrangements would have allowed individuals within the camp to observe one another's work. Someone shaping a stone tool might sit only a short distance from where food was being prepared or where others gathered near the fire. In small communities, this proximity meant that knowledge could travel naturally through observation. A person watching the careful shaping of a tool might begin to notice how pressure was applied or how particular stones fractured when struck at certain angles. Over time, Repeated exposure to these processes could gradually build familiarity with the techniques involved. Archaeological discoveries of unfinished or broken tools also offer subtle clues about learning. Tool-making is a complex skill that requires practice. When researchers find artifacts that appear less refined alongside expertly crafted tools, it may indicate different levels of experience among the people who produced them. While archaeologists cannot always determine exactly who made each tool, the presence of varied workmanship suggests that knowledge of tool-making was being practiced and refined within the community. In such environments, individuals may have learned by observing experienced toolmakers and gradually attempting the same techniques themselves. Another layer of archaeological evidence comes from long-term continuity in tool styles across generations. Certain methods of shaping stone or constructing tools appear repeatedly in archaeological layers separated by many years. This continuity suggests that communities maintain shared traditions for producing tools and other objects. Because these techniques required careful skill, they likely depended on ongoing transmission from experienced individuals to those who were still learning. Each generation inherited these traditions and carried them forward with small variations shaped by their own experiences. When researchers combine these observations with evidence from footprints, campsites, and skeletal remains, a quiet picture begins to form. Early human communities appear to have been places where knowledge lived within shared activities rather than within separate institutions. Learning happened while tools were shaped, while food was prepared, and while people gathered around fires to discuss their journeys. The archaeological record cannot reveal the full richness of those moments, but it shows that the traces of human life were often concentrated in spaces where many members of the community were present together. From these fragments preserved in soil and stone, researchers gain a sense of how generations once lived side by side, gradually passing practical knowledge through the ordinary routines that sustained the group. When historians and anthropologists examine societies across different periods of human history, they often notice that the boundary between youth and adulthood has not always been defined in the same way. In many modern societies, age categories are marked clearly through institutions and legal systems. There are specific ages for beginning school, entering the workforce, or participating fully in civic life. These boundaries create a structured pathway that separates childhood from adult responsibility. Yet when researchers look at smaller communities living closer to subsistence economies, the transition between stages of life often appears more gradual. Responsibilities and skills are not always assigned according to strict age categories. Instead, they tend to develop slowly as individuals gain experience and familiarity with the tasks that sustain the group. This gradual shift reflects the structure of communities where daily survival depends on cooperation among many members rather than on specialized roles organized by large institutions. In such settings, activities that support the community are usually visible to everyone. Preparing food, maintaining shelters, repairing tools, and planning travel routes are all tasks that occur within shared spaces. Because these activities are part of ordinary life, individuals encounter them repeatedly from an early age. Over time, familiarity with these tasks grows naturally through observation and participation. Anthropologists studying subsistence communities sometimes describe this process as learning through inclusion. Instead of separating younger individuals from the daily routines of the group, the community allows them to remain present within those routines while they gradually develop the skills needed to contribute. At first, participation may involve only small forms of assistance. Someone might help carry gathered plants, sort materials used for tools, or accompany others during short journeys. As experience grows, participation may slowly expand to include more complex activities. The key feature of this process is that responsibility increases step by step rather than appearing suddenly at a particular age. This gradual transition also reflects the practical realities of life in small communities. When a group depends on cooperation for survival, every member eventually learns the skills required to support the community. Yet these skills often take many years to develop fully. Tool-making, navigation across landscapes, and knowledge of seasonal resources all require patience and repeated exposure. Rather than waiting for a specific age to begin learning these abilities, individuals encounter them naturally while living within the group. Over time, familiarity becomes competence as experience accumulates. Another important element of this gradual transition is the role of social relationships. Early human communities were often organized around extended families and networks of kinship. Within these networks, knowledge could be shared through many different relationships rather than through a single instructor. Parents, relatives, and other experienced members of the group all contributed to the process of teaching practical skills and social norms. Through daily interaction with multiple generations, younger individuals gained exposure to a wide range of experiences and perspectives. This environment created many opportunities for observation and learning. When viewed from this perspective, the distinction between childhood and adulthood becomes less about a strict boundary and more about a continuum of development. Individuals gradually moved along this continuum as their understanding of the world expanded. Each season of experience added new layers of knowledge about the environment, the community, and the responsibilities required to sustain both. In societies organized around close cooperation with the natural world, growing up often meant becoming increasingly familiar with the tasks that allowed the group to live within that environment. In communities where daily life was organized around shared survival, the movement from youth toward adulthood often unfolded through experience rather than through clearly marked milestones. Instead of reaching a particular birthday that suddenly changed a person's role in society, individuals gradually develop the abilities needed to participate more fully in the life of the group. This pattern can be observed in many small-scale societies documented by anthropologists, where skills emerge slowly through years of observation, imitation, and practice. The environment in which people lived played an important role in shaping this gradual transition. When a community depends directly on the land for food and resources, practical knowledge becomes one of its most valuable forms of wealth. Understanding how to locate water, identify edible plants, read the movement of animals, and navigate through unfamiliar terrain requires long familiarity with the surrounding landscape. These abilities cannot be learned instantly. Instead, they grow from repeated encounters with the same environments over many seasons. As individuals accompany others during daily activities, they gradually recognize patterns that were once difficult to see. A path that first appeared confusing may later become familiar. A plant that once looked like many others may become recognizable through its subtle features. Over time, these small recognitions accumulate into a practical understanding of the world. Within such environments, learning is closely connected to participation. Individuals often begin by observing how experienced members of the group approach a task. They notice how tools are held, how materials are chosen, and how decisions are made when conditions change. At first, their role may remain limited to watching and listening. Yet as familiarity grows, they may begin to assist in simple ways. Carrying materials, helping maintain a fire, or accompanying others on short journeys allows them to become part of the process while still learning from those with more experience. Through these repeated experiences, knowledge becomes tied to the situations where it is needed. This connection between learning and real environments can shape how individuals understand responsibility. When someone begins to recognize the patterns of the landscape or the steps required to complete a task, they gradually become capable of contributing more actively to the life of the community. The transition does not occur suddenly. Instead, it unfolds through a series of small expansions in participation. Each new skill allows the individual to take part in additional activities, strengthening both personal confidence and the cooperative structure of the group. Social relationships also play an important role in guiding this process. In close-knit communities, individuals spend much of their time with relatives and other familiar members of the group. These relationships provide opportunities for guidance, encouragement, and correction when necessary. Advice about how to approach a task or interpret a situation may emerge naturally during conversation or shared work. Because learning is embedded within relationships, the transmission of knowledge often carries a sense of continuity between generations. Older individuals pass on their understanding not through formal instruction, but through the example of their actions and the stories they share. When researchers compare this gradual transition with the structured age systems common in modern societies, an important difference becomes visible. Today, institutions often divide life into clearly defined stages, each associated with particular expectations. In earlier communities shaped by subsistence living, development was more fluid. Skills and responsibilities expanded gradually as individuals accumulated experience within the shared routines of daily life. Growing up meant moving steadily along a path of increasing familiarity with the environment and the cooperative tasks that allowed the community to endure. In communities organized around shared survival, the gradual movement from youth toward adulthood was often closely connected to the rhythm of daily tasks. Responsibilities did not appear all at once, and they were rarely assigned through formal rules tied to a precise age. Instead, people became capable of contributing to the life of the group step by step as their experience grew. Each new skill expanded the range of activities in which they could take part, allowing them to move naturally toward greater involvement in the work that sustained the community. The structure of life in small mobile groups supported this gradual process. Many activities were visible to everyone present in the camp. Preparing food, maintaining fires, repairing tools, and discussing plans for travel usually happened in shared spaces rather than behind closed doors. Because these tasks were carried out in the open, individuals growing up within the community could observe them repeatedly over long periods of time. Observation alone, however, was only the beginning. As familiarity with these activities increased, people could begin participating in modest ways. A person might assist with carrying materials, sorting gathered plants, or helping arrange items used in food preparation. These small forms of participation allowed them to experience the rhythm of the work without needing to master every detail immediately. Over time, repeated involvement built confidence and practical understanding. This gradual expansion of responsibility often reflected the natural pace of human development. Physical strength, coordination, and judgment all grow over many years. Communities that lived close to natural environments tended to recognize these differences in ability through practical observation rather than through fixed categories. Someone who had become familiar with certain tasks might take on more of those responsibilities, while others continued observing until they felt ready to try them. In this way, the process of learning remained flexible and responsive to individual experience. Another important element of this transition was the role of cooperation within the group. Early human communities depended heavily on collaboration. Gathering food, traveling across unfamiliar landscapes, and maintaining temporary shelters all required people to work together. Within such environments, learning how to cooperate with others was just as important as learning technical skills. Individuals gradually became familiar with how decisions were discussed, how disagreements were resolved, and how responsibilities were shared among members of the group. Through these interactions, they developed an understanding of the social expectations that guided life within the community. Stories and shared memories often reinforced these expectations. When people gathered during quiet moments of the day, they sometimes recounted earlier journeys or unusual experiences that had shaped the group's understanding of the landscape. These narratives helped preserve knowledge about places and events while also illustrating how members of the community supported one another in difficult situations. For those listening, such stories offered guidance about the values and behaviors that allowed the group to remain cohesive. In this way, learning extended beyond practical tasks to include the social principles that help maintain cooperation. Over many seasons of observation, participation, and conversation, individuals gradually became integrated into the full life of the community. The shift from youth toward adulthood was not marked by a single moment, but by a long accumulation of experience. Each new skill, each journey through the landscape, and each shared memory added another layer to a person's understanding of their role within the group. When historians examine these patterns across the broader history of our species, they often see societies where development unfolded along a continuum rather than through sharply divided stages. Within such settings, growing up meant slowly becoming capable of participating in the shared work and relationships that sustained the human community. For most of human history, communities lived by moving through landscapes in search of food and water. This way of life is often described by anthropologists as hunting and gathering. People relied on a wide range of plants, animals, fish, and seasonal resources found within the environments around them. Groups traveled across territories that changed with the seasons, returning to familiar areas when certain plants ripened or when animals followed predictable migration routes. This mobile way of life shaped how people organized their daily activities and how knowledge was shared within the community. Over time, however, a major transformation began to appear in some regions of the world. Instead of moving continuously across the landscape, certain human groups started to remain in one place for longer periods. they began cultivating plants, tending animals, and building more permanent settlements. This shift toward agriculture did not happen suddenly, and it did not occur everywhere at the same time. Archaeological evidence shows that different regions adopted farming gradually, often over many centuries. Yet, wherever this transition took hold, it changed the structure of daily life in significant ways. Farming required a different relationship with the environment. Crops needed to be planted, tended, and harvested according to seasonal cycles. Fields had to be maintained, irrigation systems sometimes developed, and food stored for future use. These tasks encouraged people to remain in particular locations rather than traveling constantly across wide territories. As a result, settlements began to grow more stable and sometimes larger than the mobile camps of earlier communities. The development of permanent villages created new patterns of cooperation and responsibility. When people lived in one place for long periods, the work of maintaining fields, storing harvests, and caring for domesticated animals became part of the rhythm of community life. These activities unfolded across the entire year rather than appearing only during short hunting or gathering expeditions. Because agriculture required sustained attention to crops and land, many members of the community became involved in the work that supported the settlement. The presence of permanent structures also changed the spatial organization of daily life. Houses, storage areas, and communal spaces created environments where different tasks could occur simultaneously within a fixed settlement. People might prepare food near hearths, repair tools within sheltered spaces, or gather to discuss plans for planting and harvest. This stability allowed communities to accumulate materials and tools in ways that had been more difficult for highly mobile groups. Archaeologists studying early agricultural settlements often find storage pits, grinding stones used for processing grains, and other artifacts related to farming activities. These objects reveal how the daily work of sustaining a community gradually shifted from the immediate search for wild resources to the management of cultivated landscapes. As these new patterns of life developed, the experience of growing up within a community also began to change. A child born into a mobile hunting and gathering group encountered a world defined by movement across landscapes. In contrast, a child born into an early farming settlement grew up within a more stable environment where fields, houses, and paths remained familiar year after year. The rhythm of the seasons still shaped life, but the activities associated with those seasons became closely tied to specific locations. Fields needed tending during certain months, harvests gathered at particular times, and stored food maintained through the colder parts of the year. Over many generations, this shift towards settled life created new forms of social organization and new expectations about how knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. As farming gradually became established in different parts of the world, the structure of human communities began to change in subtle but important ways. Agriculture required people to invest long periods of time in specific places. Fields needed preparation before planting. Crops required attention while they grew, and harvests had to be gathered and stored when the season arrived. These cycles tied communities more closely to particular pieces of land than had been typical for highly mobile groups. Instead of moving frequently across wide territories, many people began living in settlements that remained in the same location for years or even generations. This stability transformed the spatial environment in which daily life unfolded. Paths formed between houses, fields, and water sources. Storage areas were constructed to protect harvests from weather and animals. Tools used for farming and food processing accumulated in places where people returned repeatedly. Archaeologists studying early farming villages often find grinding stones, storage pits, pottery, and other objects that reveal how food production had become an organized part of community life. The presence of these materials suggests that daily tasks were increasingly linked to maintaining fields, preparing crops, and preserving food for future use. Within this more settled environment, the rhythm of life followed the seasonal cycles of agriculture. Planting seasons required coordinated effort to prepare soil and place seeds into the ground. Later in the year, crops needed tending to ensure they continued growing. When harvest time arrived, many members of the community might work together to gather and store the food that would sustain them through the coming months. These shared efforts created periods when large portions of the community focused on the same tasks at the same time. The presence of permanent settlements also meant that knowledge about the land became increasingly specific. People learned which areas of soil produced the best harvests, where water collected after rainfall, and how seasonal weather patterns affected crops. Over time, this information accumulated within the memory of the community and was passed from one generation to the next. Younger members of the settlement growing up within this environment would encounter the rhythms of agriculture from an early age. The planting of seeds, the growth of crops through changing weather, and the gathering of harvests became familiar patterns in the yearly cycle of life. Because these activities repeated in the same locations each year, the landscape itself became a record of accumulated knowledge. Fields, irrigation channels, and pathways reflected the practical understanding that earlier generations had developed about the land. At the same time, agriculture introduced new forms of cooperation within communities. Maintaining crops and storing food required planning and coordination among many individuals. Decisions about planting times, harvest preparation, and the distribution of stored food often involved discussions among members of the settlement. These interactions created opportunities for knowledge to circulate within the community. Conversations about weather conditions, soil quality, or the timing of seasonal work helped maintain a shared understanding of how to manage the cultivated landscape. For individuals growing up within these early agricultural communities, learning was closely connected to the rhythms of the farming year. Observing how seeds were planted, how crops were cared for, and how harvests were prepared allowed them to become familiar with the processes that supported the settlement's survival. Over time, participation in these activities gradually expanded as individuals gained experience and confidence. The environment of the village, with its fields and shared spaces, provided a setting where practical knowledge about agriculture could be encountered repeatedly through everyday life. In this way, the transition from mobile hunting and gathering to settled farming began to reshape how communities organized both work and learning across generations. As agricultural settlements continued to develop, the stability of village life gradually created new patterns in how communities organized time and responsibility. The yearly rhythm of planting and harvest divided the calendar into recognizable phases that returned again and again. Unlike the constantly shifting routes of highly mobile groups, agricultural life encouraged people to remain in the same landscape through many seasonal cycles. Over years and generations, the land itself became deeply familiar. Fields carried the memory of earlier harvests, pathways connected homes with water sources, and storage areas preserved the results of past labor. This continuity created a setting in which knowledge accumulated within a fixed environment rather than across wide territories. For individuals growing up within these early villages, the rhythms of agriculture formed part of everyday awareness. The preparation of soil before planting, the careful watching of young crops as they grew, and the gathering of harvests near the end of the season became events that repeated throughout life. Each cycle of the year provided another opportunity to observe how the community interacted with the land. Over time, these repeated experiences allowed individuals to recognize patterns within the agricultural landscape. They could notice how weather affected crops, how soil conditions changed after rainfall, or how the timing of planting influenced the size of the harvest. Because these activities occurred within the same locations year after year, the environment itself acted as a record of accumulated experience. The presence of permanent settlements also meant that communities could store tools, seeds, and food in ways that had been difficult for mobile groups. Storage pits, pottery vessels, and constructed buildings allowed harvests to be preserved for future use. These stored resources created a buffer against seasonal shortages and helped sustain larger populations within the same area. Archaeological sites from early agricultural societies often contain evidence of such storage systems, revealing how communities developed methods for protecting their harvest from animals, weather, and decay. The management of these resources required careful planning and cooperation among members of the settlement. Decisions about when to plant crops, how to distribute stored food, or how to repair irrigation channels often involved discussions among several individuals who shared knowledge about the land and its seasonal changes. These conversations allowed practical understanding to circulate through the community. When people discussed the condition of fields or the timing of seasonal work, they were also sharing observations that had been gathered through years of experience. Younger members of the community present during these discussions could hear how older individuals interpreted the landscape and responded to its changes. Through repeated exposure, they gradually learned to recognize the same patterns themselves. Over time, the village became a place where environmental knowledge was layered across generations. Each harvest, each season of planting, and each unexpected weather event added another chapter to the community's understanding of the land. Fields that had once been cleared by earlier generations continued to produce crops long after the original labor was finished. Irrigation channels, storage pits, and houses became physical reminders of how people had shaped the landscape in order to live within it. For those growing up within these settlements, learning about the environment involved becoming familiar with these long-term relationships between land, seasons, and human effort. In this way, the development of agriculture slowly transformed not only how people produced food, but also how communities passed knowledge across generations. The stable landscapes of early villages created new opportunities for memory, planning, and shared understanding to accumulate in the same place over time. As agricultural settlements grew over many generations, some villages slowly expanded into larger and more complex communities. The development of farming allowed populations to increase because food could be produced and stored in greater quantities than before. Over time, clusters of houses grew into larger settlements where many families lived close together. In certain regions, these settlements gradually evolved into early towns and cities. Archaeological evidence from different parts of the world shows that this transformation occurred independently in several places, including river valleys where fertile soil and reliable water supported large agricultural systems. Living in larger communities created a different social environment from the smaller groups that had characterized much of earlier human history. In small mobile groups, most people knew one another personally and participated directly in many of the same activities. In larger settlements, daily life became more diverse. Some individuals focused on farming, while others specialized in making tools, pottery, textiles, or other goods. Over time, these specialized skills created networks of exchange within the community. People began trading products and services, allowing different occupations to emerge within the same settlement. This increasing complexity gradually led to the formation of new social structures. As settlements grew, communities developed ways to organize work, resolve disputes, and manage shared resources such as irrigation systems or storage facilities. Leaders or councils sometimes appeared to coordinate activities that affected the entire settlement. Written records eventually emerged in some early urban societies, allowing information about trade, laws, and religious practices to be preserved beyond individual memory. These changes transformed the way knowledge circulated within human communities. In earlier mobile groups, knowledge had been carried almost entirely through direct experience and oral tradition. In growing towns and cities, new institutions began to appear that shaped how information was transmitted. Workshops allowed apprentices to learn specialized crafts from experienced artisans. Religious centers preserved ceremonial knowledge and traditions. Administrative systems recorded economic transactions and social rules. Although these developments did not immediately create the modern idea of childhood, they gradually introduced environments where learning could take place in more structured ways. The presence of specialized skills meant that individuals sometimes needed longer periods to master particular crafts or responsibilities. Learning how to shape metal tools, construct buildings, or maintain irrigation channels required practice guided by experienced members of the community. In some cases, young people might spend years assisting skilled workers, while gradually acquiring the techniques of a trade. This form of apprenticeship allowed complex knowledge to be passed from one generation to the next in organized settings. The physical layout of early towns also influenced how people experienced daily life. Streets, workshops, storage buildings, and communal gathering spaces created environments where many activities occurred simultaneously. People moving through these spaces could observe the work of artisans, traders, farmers, and administrators. The constant interaction between different occupations created opportunities for knowledge to circulate through conversation, observation, and cooperation. For individuals growing up within these expanding communities, the world they encountered looked different from the landscapes of earlier mobile groups. Instead of moving across wide territories, they spent most of their lives within settlements where buildings, roads, and cultivated fields defined the environment. The complexity of these communities required new forms of organization and communication. As these structures developed, they slowly shaped the ways in which knowledge, responsibility, and social roles were passed between generations. As towns gradually expanded into larger urban centers, daily life began to include forms of organization that had rarely existed in earlier human communities. Growing populations required systems that could coordinate the activities of many individuals living in close proximity. Roads connected different parts of the settlement, marketplaces allowed goods to circulate, and public spaces became places where people gathered to exchange information. These environments created new ways for knowledge and skills to be shared within society. In earlier agricultural villages, most individuals were directly involved in producing food or maintaining the land that supported the community. In larger towns, however, economic life became more varied. Some people still worked in fields outside the settlement, but many others focused on specialized crafts and services. Metal workers shaped tools and weapons from copper or bronze. Potters created vessels used for storing grain and water. Builders constructed homes, walls, and temples. Traders moved goods between distant regions, carrying materials that were not available locally. Each of these activities required specific knowledge that had to be learned through experience. The presence of specialized crafts encouraged the development of structured forms of learning within families and workshops. A young person who wished to learn a particular craft might spend many years assisting an experienced artisan. At first, their tasks might involve simple preparation such as gathering materials or maintaining tools. Over time, they would observe how more complex processes were carried out. Gradually, they might begin to practice the same techniques under the guidance of someone who had already mastered the craft. This method of apprenticeship allowed communities to preserve specialized knowledge across generations without relying on written instructions. Workshops themselves became places where practical knowledge was visible. In a metalworker's space, the shaping of heated metal revealed techniques that had been refined over many years. In a potter's workshop, the turning of clay on a wheel and the careful control of fire inside a kiln demonstrated skills developed through long practice. Anyone present within these spaces could observe the steps involved in producing these objects. Even individuals who did not become artisans themselves might develop a basic understanding of how different goods were created. The growth of towns also introduced administrative and cultural institutions that played new roles in the transmission of knowledge. In some early civilizations, scribes recorded economic transactions, laws, and historical events using systems of writing. Temples and religious centers preserved traditions, rituals, and stories that helped define the identity of the community. These institutions created environments where knowledge was collected, organized, and remembered in ways that extended beyond oral memory alone. For people growing up in these increasingly complex societies, the experience of learning gradually expanded beyond the immediate tasks of daily survival. Observing craftspeople, hearing stories in communal spaces, and witnessing the organization of markets and ceremonies all contributed to an understanding of how the larger community functioned. The settlement itself became a landscape filled with many forms of knowledge, each connected to different activities and occupations. Over generations, this complexity continued to grow. Communities developed systems of law, religious traditions, and economic exchange that required coordination among large numbers of people. Although these developments did not instantly create the modern concept of childhood, they slowly introduced environments where learning and responsibility could be organized in new ways. As societies became more structured, the pathways through which individuals learned skills and knowledge began to reflect the expanding complexity of the communities in which they lived. As urban communities continued to grow, the structure of society gradually became layered with new forms of organization. In earlier villages, most activities were closely tied to the production of food and the maintenance of land. In larger towns and early cities, however, people began participating in many different kinds of work that supported the functioning of the settlement. Markets connected farmers with traders and craftspeople. Administrative officials recorded agreements and organized labor for large projects such as irrigation canals, walls, or temples. Religious centers preserved rituals that shaped the cultural identity of the community. Each of these institutions required knowledge that extended beyond the immediate needs of daily survival. Within this expanding social environment, the transmission of knowledge slowly became more specialized. Certain skills required long practice and guidance from experienced individuals. Metalworking, architecture, navigation, and long-distance trade all depended on techniques that had to be learned carefully. Workshops and households became places where these abilities were passed from one generation to the next. A person might spend many years assisting someone who had already mastered a craft, observing the details of the work and gradually gaining the experience needed to perform it independently. This method of apprenticeship allowed communities to maintain complex skills without relying entirely on written instructions. At the same time, the development of writing systems in some early civilizations introduced a new way of preserving knowledge. Clay tablets, carved inscriptions, and later written manuscripts allowed certain kinds of information to be recorded and stored. Records of trade, laws, religious practices, and historical events could now remain accessible beyond the memory of a single generation. Scribes trained to read and write these systems held an important role in many early societies because they helped maintain the administrative and cultural memory of the community. Although literacy was often limited to small groups of specialists, the existence of written records gradually changed how knowledge could circulate through society. The physical layout of growing cities also created environments where different forms of knowledge were visible within daily life. Streets connected markets, workshops, religious buildings, and administrative centers. As people moved through these spaces, they encountered many activities occurring simultaneously. Traders weighed goods in marketplaces, artisans shaped materials into tools and ornaments, and officials recorded transactions or organized public projects. These scenes formed a living display of the economic and social systems that supported the city. For individuals growing up within such environments, the experience of learning extended across many different areas of community life. Observing how goods were exchanged in the market, how artisans shaped materials in their workshops, or how ceremonies unfolded in public spaces provided insight into the functioning of the society around them. Each encounter offered a glimpse into the networks of cooperation that allowed large settlements to operate successfully. Over generations, this growing complexity gradually reshaped the pathways through which people learned skills and responsibilities. While early human communities had shared knowledge primarily through observation within small groups, urban societies introduced new layers of organization that structured how experience was gained. Workshops, religious centers, administrative offices, and marketplaces all became places where different forms of understanding were preserved and transmitted. Within these environments, individuals gradually discovered how their roles fit into the broader structure of the community. The expansion of cities therefore marked an important moment in the long history of human societies. As populations increased and institutions multiplied, the social world in which people grew up became increasingly complex. Learning was no longer limited to the immediate tasks of survival within a landscape. Instead, it began to include the many systems that allowed large communities to function across generations. As human societies continued to grow more complex, another gradual transformation began to appear in the way knowledge was organized and transmitted across generations. In earlier communities shaped by hunting, gathering, or early agriculture, learning was deeply embedded in the ordinary routines of daily life. Knowledge about landscapes, tools, and social relationships flowed naturally through observation and participation. With the rise of large settlements and expanding systems of administration, however, certain kinds of knowledge began to require more structured methods of preservation. Written language played an important role in this shift. When early systems of writing appeared in parts of the world, such as river valley civilizations, they allowed information to be recorded in durable forms. Clay tablets, inscriptions carved into stone, and later manuscripts preserved details about trade, taxation, laws, and religious practices. These records created a new relationship between knowledge and memory. Instead of relying entirely on oral tradition, societies could now maintain information in written form that could be consulted long after the original events had passed. The ability to record information also created new social roles within these societies. Individuals who learned to read and write often became scribes, administrators, or religious specialists responsible for maintaining records. Because literacy required time and practice to master, the process of learning these skills gradually became more organized. In some early civilizations, training for scribes took place within temples, palaces, or other institutional settings where experienced instructors guided students through the complex systems of writing used by their culture. Although only a small portion of the population typically had access to this type of education, the existence of such training marked an important step toward the formal organization of learning. Beyond writing, Other forms of knowledge also began to accumulate within institutions connected to religion, governance, and trade. Religious centers preserved ceremonial traditions and cosmological beliefs that shaped the cultural identity of the community. Administrative systems required individuals capable of counting resources, measuring land, and organizing labor for large projects. The construction of irrigation systems, walls, or monumental buildings demanded coordinated planning and technical skill. Each of these activities depended on the careful transmission of knowledge across generations. In this environment, learning gradually became associated with specific places where knowledge was maintained. Temples, workshops, and administrative centers functioned as hubs where experience and instruction could be concentrated. People entering these spaces encountered individuals who had dedicated many years to mastering particular skills. Observing their work allowed newcomers to begin understanding how these systems operated. Over time, the repeated presence of learners within such environments created early forms of educational tradition. Although these systems were still far from the universal schooling familiar today, they represented an important step in the historical development of organized learning. For individuals growing up in these societies, the experience of acquiring knowledge began to involve both observation within everyday life and participation in more structured forms of instruction. Someone might still learn practical skills by assisting family members or observing daily activities within the community. At the same time, certain specialized abilities could require extended periods of guided training within particular institutions. This combination of informal and organized learning gradually reshaped the way societies thought about the process of preparing individuals for their future roles. Over many centuries, these developments contributed to the slow emergence of environments where education could take place across longer stretches of early life. As institutions connected to religion, governance, and specialized crafts became more prominent in many societies, the process of learning gradually began to take on new forms. Knowledge was still shared through observation and participation in everyday life, but certain fields of expertise now required longer and more deliberate training. Writing systems, administrative record-keeping, architectural planning, and religious traditions often depended on techniques that could not be mastered quickly. These activities encouraged the development of environments where learning could occur under the guidance of experienced practitioners over extended periods of time. One of the clearest examples of this change appears in the training of scribes in early literate societies. Writing systems such as cuneiform or hieroglyphic scripts involved hundreds of symbols and required careful attention to form and meaning. Individuals learning to write often spent many years practicing these symbols and memorizing the conventions used to record transactions, laws, and historical events. Archaeological discoveries from ancient cities have revealed tablets containing repeated lines of symbols that appear to be exercises created by learners. These tablets show that instruction sometimes followed structured routines in which students practiced copying words, phrases, or lists in order to become familiar with the written language of their culture. Although such systems of learning were limited to small groups within society, they marked an important step toward the formal organization of education. Knowledge could now be preserved and transmitted not only through memory, but also through written examples that learners could study and reproduce. The presence of teachers, apprentices, and training spaces created environments where experience accumulated across generations of instruction. Each generation of learners built upon the knowledge recorded and preserved by those who came before them. Other forms of specialized learning developed in parallel with writing. Skilled artisans often maintained workshops where techniques for shaping metal, carving stone, or weaving textiles were practiced daily. Apprentices working alongside experienced artisans could observe the sequence of actions required to transform raw materials into finished objects. At first, their contributions might involve preparing tools or materials. Over time, they would gradually attempt more complex tasks under the supervision of someone who had already mastered the craft. This extended process of guided learning ensured that important techniques were not lost from one generation to the next. The growth of administrative systems also required individuals capable of managing resources and coordinating large projects. Measuring land for agriculture, calculating the distribution of stored grain, or organizing labor for building works demanded practical knowledge of counting, measurement, and planning. In societies where such tasks became central to governance, Individuals responsible for these duties often developed specialized expertise that had to be learned carefully over time. Training for these roles might occur within administrative centers where experienced officials demonstrated how records were kept and decisions were organized. For individuals growing up within these expanding societies, the landscape of learning gradually became more varied. Some knowledge continued to flow through family relationships and daily participation in community life. Other forms of knowledge became associated with particular places such as workshops, temples, or administrative offices. These environments introduced new expectations about how long it might take to master certain skills and how individuals would prepare for specific roles within the community. Over centuries, these changes slowly contributed to the idea that learning could extend across a significant portion of early life, preparing individuals for participation in increasingly complex societies. As systems of organized learning slowly expanded within complex societies, they began to influence how communities thought about the early years of life. In earlier periods of human history, learning had been closely tied to daily activities such as gathering food, traveling through landscapes, or maintaining tools used by the community. Knowledge flowed through observation, conversation, and participation within the shared environment of the group. As societies developed writing, administration, specialized crafts, however, some forms of knowledge required more time and structured attention. This gradual shift did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not immediately create the modern concept of schooling. In many ancient societies, formal instruction remained limited to small segments of the population. Most people still learned the skills of farming, craft production, or household management through observation within their families and communities. Yet the presence of organized training for scribes, artisans, and administrators introduced a new idea into human society: the possibility that learning could be concentrated in specific places and guided through deliberate instruction. Temples, workshops, and administrative centers increasingly functioned as environments where knowledge accumulated across generations. These places preserved not only practical techniques but also cultural traditions and written records that shaped how communities understood their history and beliefs. Individuals who spent time within these institutions often followed long paths of learning under the supervision of experienced mentors. Over years of practice, they developed skills that allowed them to take on specialized roles within society. This pattern gradually expanded the range of knowledge that people could acquire during the early stages of life. At the same time, the growth of cities and complex economies meant that societies required individuals with different kinds of expertise. Large construction projects required planning and coordination. Systems of trade connected distant regions and depended on accurate records of goods and agreements. Religious ceremonies preserved traditions that shaped the identity of communities. Each of these activities required knowledge that had to be maintained carefully across generations. The need to preserve this knowledge encouraged societies to invest time and effort in teaching certain individuals the skills needed to sustain these systems. For those growing up in such environments, the experience of learning began to include both informal observation and more structured guidance. Someone might spend part of their early years helping family members with daily work, while also observing specialized tasks carried out in workshops or administrative spaces. Over time, individuals who showed interest or ability in particular areas might begin longer periods of training under the supervision of experienced practitioners. This arrangement allowed societies to preserve complex knowledge while still maintaining the traditional pathways of learning that had shaped human communities for thousands of years. Although these developments represented important steps toward organized education, the transformation was gradual. In many regions of the world, learning remained closely connected to family life and local traditions. Formal schooling as it exists today would not become widespread until much later in history. Yet the foundations of that transformation were already taking shape. Institutions that preserved writing, specialized crafts, and administrative knowledge created environments where extended learning could occur within the early stages of life. These environments slowly expanded the idea that preparing individuals for the responsibilities of society might involve long periods of guided instruction. Over time, this idea would continue to evolve as human societies grew larger and more interconnected across the world. By the time complex civilizations had taken shape across several parts of the world, human societies had already passed through thousands of generations, shaped by hunting, gathering, and early agriculture. For most of that immense stretch of time, the rhythm of growing up was closely connected to the rhythm of survival. Learning occurred while people traveled across landscapes, gathered food, built shelters, and cooperated with others to sustain the group. Yet as cities expanded and institutions became more organized, the experience of early life slowly began to change again. One of the most important forces behind this change was the increasing complexity of economic life. In large agricultural societies, fields had to be cultivated, harvests stored, irrigation maintained, and trade networks organized across long distances. These systems required coordination among many individuals. Markets connected villages with towns, and caravans carried goods between distant regions. As these networks expanded, societies needed people capable of managing records, measuring goods, negotiating exchanges, and maintaining systems of law and governance. The presence of these responsibilities created environments where knowledge became increasingly specialized. Within growing cities, people could encounter many different forms of work. Farmers brought grain into markets, traders exchanged goods from distant lands, and artisans shaped materials into tools, textiles, and ornaments. Religious ceremonies gathered communities in temples or public spaces, while officials recorded transactions and organized public labor. These scenes revealed a society that was no longer centered only on the immediate tasks of food gathering or cultivation. Instead, it had developed multiple layers of activity that allowed large populations to live together within shared systems of production and exchange. For individuals growing up within these societies, the process of learning gradually expanded to include an understanding of these systems. Observing the activities of markets, workshops, and administrative centers allowed them to see how goods moved through the economy and how decisions were made within the community. Some people continued learning primarily through family traditions tied to farming or craft production. Others entered apprenticeships where they spent years mastering particular skills under experienced practitioners. This variety of learning environments reflected the increasing diversity of roles within complex societies. At the same time, written records and administrative practices preserved knowledge about how these systems operated. Lists of goods, contracts of trade, and records of harvests provided a structured memory for the community. These documents allowed societies to manage resources across large territories and long periods of time. Individuals trained to interpret and maintain these records played an important role in sustaining the stability of the society. Because these skills required careful study and practice, the time devoted to learning certain abilities slowly extended across the earlier stages of life. Yet, even as these changes unfolded, many traditional patterns of learning continued. Families still passed on practical knowledge through daily work. Farmers taught the timing of planting and harvest. Artisans demonstrated techniques within workshops, and elders shared stories that preserved the memory of earlier generations. The difference was that these forms of knowledge now existed alongside emerging institutions that organized learning in more deliberate ways. The world into which individuals were born had become more complex than the environments experienced by earlier generations of humans. Growing up increasingly meant learning not only how to survive within a landscape, but also how to navigate the economic, cultural, and administrative systems that supported large communities. As economic networks and political institutions expanded across early civilizations, another transformation quietly unfolded within the social structure of human life. Communities increasingly recognized that certain roles required long preparation before a person could perform them reliably. Managing irrigation systems, coordinating large construction projects, conducting trade across distant regions, or maintaining religious traditions all demanded a level of knowledge that could not be gained quickly. The growing complexity of these responsibilities gradually influenced how societies organized the process of learning. In earlier periods of human history, knowledge had been passed mainly through observation within daily activities. A person learned by accompanying others through landscapes, participating in food gathering, or assisting with tasks around the camp or village. As societies grew larger and more specialized, however, some forms of learning began to extend across many years of careful practice. This change did not eliminate traditional learning through observation, but it added another layer to the experience of growing up. One of the clearest examples of this development can be seen in the continuation of apprenticeship systems. Crafts that required technical skill often depended on long periods of training under experienced artisans. The shaping of metal tools, the carving of stone for architecture, or the weaving of complex textiles required careful attention to detail. Apprentices working within these environments might spend many years observing the techniques used by their mentors, while gradually attempting more difficult tasks themselves. Each stage of learning expanded their familiarity with the materials and tools involved in the craft. Over time, these individuals became capable of carrying the tradition forward to the next generation. At the same time, administrative systems in many civilizations required individuals capable of maintaining records, measuring land, and organizing economic activity. The ability to read and write written scripts, where they existed, often required dedicated training. Learning to interpret these systems demanded patience and repeated practice, since written symbols could carry complex meanings connected to law, religion, and economic exchange. Because of this difficulty, the process of becoming literate in many ancient societies extended across years of study guided by experienced teachers. The existence of these training systems gradually influenced how societies viewed the early stages of life. When certain roles required extended preparation, individuals who intended to perform those roles often spent significant portions of their early years learning the skills associated with them. This process created a longer period between birth and full participation in specialized responsibilities. Although most people still entered the daily work of farming, craft production, or trade relatively early, the presence of specialized roles demonstrated that some knowledge required extended preparation before it could be practiced independently. Cultural traditions also reinforced this pattern. Stories, rituals, and ceremonies often preserved the historical memory of communities and the values that guided social life. Participating in these traditions required familiarity with shared narratives, symbols, and customs that had developed over many generations. Elders who carried this cultural memory often transmitted it gradually through storytelling, instruction, and participation in communal gatherings. Over time, younger members of the community absorbed these traditions as part of their understanding of how the society functioned. In this way, the expansion of civilizations gradually created environments where learning could stretch across a longer span of early life. Knowledge about the natural world, specialized crafts, written systems, and cultural traditions all contributed to the preparation of individuals for their roles within society. These changes did not immediately produce the modern concept of childhood, but they quietly laid some of the foundations that would later shape how societies organized education and responsibility across generations. As complex societies continued to evolve, the gradual extension of learning began to shape how communities understood the path from early life toward adult responsibility. The transformation did not occur through a single moment or decision. Instead, it emerged slowly through the combined influence of economic specialization, cultural traditions, and the increasing scale of human settlements. Over generations, these forces quietly expanded the range of knowledge that individuals were expected to acquire before fully participating in the social and economic systems around them. In earlier periods of human history, most communities had depended on a relatively small set of essential skills. The ability to find food, recognize safe water sources, build shelter, and cooperate with others in the group formed the core of survival. These abilities were learned through repeated participation in daily life. Observation and imitation allowed individuals to develop competence as they accompanied more experienced members of the community through the tasks that sustained the group. As long as human societies remained small and mobile, this pattern of learning through participation provided everything necessary for survival. The expansion of agricultural and urban societies gradually introduced a wider range of responsibilities. Farming itself required knowledge about planting cycles, soil conditions, and seasonal weather patterns. Trade networks connected distant regions, making it necessary to understand systems of exchange and negotiation. Craft production involved techniques refined over generations of practice. Administrative institutions developed systems for recording resources, organizing labor, and maintaining laws. Each of these activities added new layers of knowledge to the functioning of society. Because these responsibilities required skill and experience, individuals often needed extended periods of observation and instruction before they could perform them independently. This extension of learning slowly created a broader space within early life devoted to preparation rather than immediate contribution. Even though many individuals still participated in daily work from a relatively young age, certain forms of expertise required additional years of practice. Mastering the techniques of metalworking, stone construction, or written administration demanded careful attention to detail and familiarity with systems that had become increasingly sophisticated. The growth of cultural traditions also contributed to this expanding period of preparation. Religious rituals, shared stories, and social customs preserved the identity of communities across generations. Participating fully in these traditions required understanding the meanings embedded within them. Elders who carried this knowledge often shared it gradually through ceremonies, storytelling, and daily conversation. Through repeated exposure to these cultural practices, younger members of the community learned how their society understood the world and its place within it. Over time, the accumulation of these different forms of knowledge reshaped the environment in which people grew up. Instead of preparing only for the immediate tasks of survival, individuals increasingly learned how to navigate the larger systems that structured their societies. Economic exchange, cultural traditions, administrative institutions, and specialized crafts all became part of the world they encountered. Growing up meant gradually becoming familiar with these interconnected layers of activity that allowed large populations to live together in organized communities. By this stage in human history, the foundations were already forming for a new understanding of early life. Although the modern concept of childhood had not yet fully emerged, the growing complexity of human societies had begun to stretch the path between birth and full adult responsibility. The experiences of earlier generations, shaped by mobility, subsistence, and immediate survival, were slowly giving way to environments where preparation for social roles could occupy a longer portion of life. By the time many large civilizations had stabilized their systems of agriculture, trade, and governance, another subtle transformation was beginning to unfold within human societies. The environments in which people grew up were no longer shaped only by immediate survival tasks such as gathering food or tending small fields. Instead, individuals were increasingly surrounded by complex networks of social roles, economic exchange, and cultural traditions that required a wider range of understanding. Preparing to participate fully in these systems often required years of observation, guidance, and gradual experience. One important factor behind this change was the increasing density of human populations. In earlier mobile communities, groups were relatively small and spread across large territories. Most people knew one another personally, and the number of distinct roles within the group was limited. In growing agricultural regions and expanding cities, however, thousands of individuals might live within the same landscape. This concentration of people allowed societies to develop more specialized forms of work and organization. Farmers cultivated fields beyond the edges of the city. Traders connected distant regions through networks of exchange, and artisans produced tools and goods that circulated through markets. Each of these activities required its own set of skills and knowledge. The result was a social environment where individuals encountered many different paths of participation within the community. Some continued family traditions in farming or craft production, while others entered specialized roles connected to administration, trade, or religious practice. Learning how these different systems functioned required familiarity, not only with practical techniques but also with the social expectations that guided cooperation between large numbers of people. In such environments, knowledge often accumulated across generations in more structured ways. Experienced individuals who had spent many years working within particular roles became sources of guidance for those who were beginning to learn. A person entering a craft workshop or administrative office might spend long periods observing how tasks were organized before gradually taking on more responsibility. This extended process of preparation ensured that the systems supporting the community could continue functioning reliably across generations. Cultural traditions also played a role in shaping this environment of preparation. Stories, ceremonies, and shared historical memories preserved the identity of communities and reminded individuals of their place within a larger social order. These traditions were often transmitted through repeated participation in communal gatherings, where elders explained the meaning of events from the past. Through these narratives, individuals growing up within the community developed an understanding of how earlier generations had navigated challenges and maintained cooperation. This cultural knowledge complemented the practical skills required for economic and administrative life. The physical structure of settlements reinforced these patterns of learning. Markets, workshops, temples, and gathering spaces created environments where individuals could observe the many activities that sustained the community. Walking through these spaces revealed the interconnected nature of social life. Goods moved through markets, artisans transformed raw materials into useful objects, and officials recorded transactions that helped maintain order within the society. For those growing up in such environments, the process of learning gradually expanded beyond the immediate tasks of survival to include an understanding of the systems that allowed large populations to live together in organized communities. Over time, this expanding complexity slowly lengthened the path between early life and full participation in society. Individuals needed more experience to understand the many layers of economic, cultural, and social activity that shaped their communities. While the modern idea of childhood had not yet fully emerged, the foundations were forming for a stage of life increasingly devoted to preparation and learning before assuming complete adult responsibility. As societies continued to grow in scale and organization, the process of preparing individuals for participation in community life gradually became more complex. Earlier human groups had relied primarily on direct experience with the environment. People learned how to survive by observing others gather food, build shelters, or travel across familiar landscapes. In expanding agricultural regions and urban settlements, however, individuals increasingly encountered systems that extended far beyond the immediate tasks of daily survival. Economic exchange, political authority, cultural traditions, and religious institutions all formed part of the social environment in which people lived. Understanding these systems required time, observation, and guidance from those who already possessed experience within them. One important change appeared in the growing interdependence between different occupations. In smaller communities, most individuals performed similar tasks related to food production and basic tool-making. As populations increased and settlements expanded, however, different roles within society became more specialized. Farmers produced crops that were exchanged in markets. Artisans crafted tools, pottery, or textiles that circulated through trade networks. Merchants transported goods between regions, while administrators organized resources and recorded agreements. Each of these roles depended on the work of others. The functioning of the entire society relied on cooperation among people who possessed different forms of knowledge. For individuals growing up within these environments, learning how the community operated meant observing how these interconnected roles supported one another. Markets offered one of the most visible examples of this interaction. Within these spaces, goods from farms, workshops, and distant regions came together in a single location. Traders negotiated exchanges, farmers delivered harvests, and artisans offered tools or crafted objects. Observing these exchanges revealed the pathways through which resources moved across the community. Over time, repeated exposure to such environments allowed individuals to understand how economic systems functioned and how different occupations contributed to the stability of the settlement. Religious and cultural institutions also shaped this expanding environment of learning. Temples, communal gathering spaces, and ceremonial events preserved the shared traditions that connected individuals to their community. Through rituals, storytelling, and seasonal festivals, societies transmitted knowledge about their origins, their values, and their understanding of the natural world. Elders who carried these traditions often explained the meanings behind ceremonies and stories, allowing younger members of the community to gradually absorb the cultural framework that guided social life. These experiences formed another layer of knowledge that individuals encountered while growing up. Governance added yet another dimension to the social landscape. As settlements expanded, communities required systems for resolving disputes, organizing labor, and maintaining shared resources such as irrigation or storage facilities. Leaders or councils often coordinated these responsibilities. Observing how decisions were discussed and implemented allowed individuals to see how authority functioned within their society. Through repeated exposure to these processes, they gradually developed an understanding of the rules and expectations that structured cooperation among large populations. Within this complex environment, learning became a long process of becoming familiar with many interconnected systems. Individuals no longer needed only the knowledge required to gather food or build shelter. They also needed to understand the economic, cultural, and social structures that allowed their communities to operate. This expanding range of knowledge slowly lengthened the period of preparation before a person could fully navigate the responsibilities of adult life. Over generations, this gradual extension of learning helped shape the conditions that would eventually allow the idea of a distinct stage of early life to emerge more clearly in human societies. As societies continued to grow in size and complexity, the relationship between knowledge and responsibility gradually became more structured. Earlier human communities had relied mainly on direct participation in daily life as the primary method of learning. Skills necessary for survival were encountered naturally while traveling through landscapes, preparing food, or cooperating with others in small groups. In larger agricultural and urban societies, however, individuals increasingly found themselves surrounded by systems that required deeper familiarity before they could fully participate. These systems included economic exchange, political organization, religious traditions, and networks of long-distance trade. Each of these layers added new dimensions to the social world that individuals needed to understand as they grew older. One consequence of this expanding complexity was the increasing importance of accumulated experience. In societies where agriculture, craft production, administration, and trade operated simultaneously, the knowledge required to navigate these activities could not always be learned quickly. Farmers needed familiarity with seasonal cycles and soil conditions. Artisans developed technical abilities that depended on years of careful practice. Merchants learned how to negotiate exchanges and maintain relationships across distant regions. Administrators became responsible for organizing resources and maintaining records that helped coordinate the activities of large populations. Because these roles required both skill and judgment, individuals often spent many years gradually developing the experience necessary to carry them out effectively. Cultural traditions reinforced this extended process of preparation. Communities often preserved their collective memory through stories, rituals, and shared ceremonies that connected present generations with those who had lived before them. Participating in these traditions allowed individuals to learn about the values and historical experiences that shaped the identity of their society. Elders who carried these narratives frequently shared them during communal gatherings, explaining how earlier generations had responded to environmental challenges or social conflicts. Through repeated exposure to these cultural expressions, individuals gradually developed a sense of how their community understood the world and its place within it. The physical spaces of settlements also played a role in shaping this environment of learning. Markets, workshops, administrative buildings, and religious centers created a landscape where different forms of knowledge were visible within daily life. Moving through these spaces allowed individuals to observe how goods were exchanged, how materials were transformed into useful objects, and how decisions affecting the community were organized. Each of these observations contributed to a broader understanding of the systems that supported life within the settlement. Learning, therefore, became not only a matter of mastering specific tasks, but also of recognizing how many different activities were connected within a larger social structure. Over time, this environment gradually extended the pathway between early life and full adult responsibility. The increasing complexity of social, economic, and cultural systems meant that individuals needed more time to become familiar with the roles they would eventually perform. Although people still began contributing to the work of their communities at relatively early ages, the process of fully understanding how those communities functioned required years of observation and participation. In this way, the expansion of civilization slowly created conditions in which preparation for adult life occupied a longer portion of the human lifespan. By the later stages of this long historical process, the foundations had been laid for a new stage in human development. The growing recognition that individuals needed time to learn the knowledge required by complex societies would eventually contribute to the emergence of institutions dedicated specifically to education. These developments marked an important transition in the history of human life, one that gradually moved societies closer to the modern idea of a prolonged early stage devoted to learning and preparation. By the later stages of human history, especially as societies moved toward early modern periods, the structure of daily life began to shift in ways that slowly changed how communities understood the early years of human development. For most of the past, individuals had entered the responsibilities of survival gradually, through participation in the everyday activities of their families and communities. Yet as economic systems expanded and institutions became more organized, another idea began to take shape: that a longer period of preparation could exist before individuals assumed the full responsibilities of adult life. One of the most visible forces behind this transformation was the continued growth of towns and cities. As populations concentrated within larger settlements, economic life became increasingly structured around specialized occupations and organized markets. Artisans, merchants, administrators, farmers, and laborers each contributed to systems that required coordination across large populations. The functioning of these systems depended on reliable knowledge about tools, trade, record-keeping, and social rules. Preparing individuals to participate in these activities often required longer periods of observation and instruction. At the same time, cultural attitudes toward family life gradually evolved in some regions of the world. Households began to place greater emphasis on the early years of development as a time when individuals could acquire the knowledge and habits needed for participation in society. Historical records from various societies show that families increasingly recognized the importance of guiding younger members through extended periods of learning. This guidance could involve teaching practical skills within the household, introducing them to religious traditions, or preparing them for roles in trades and professions. The emergence of organized schooling in certain societies further shaped this transformation. Early forms of schools existed in ancient civilizations for specific purposes, such as training scribes or preserving religious knowledge. Over time, however, broader forms of instruction began to appear in some regions. Educational environments allowed individuals to spend extended periods learning, reading, writing, arithmetic, and other subjects that supported participation in administrative or commercial systems. Although access to such education remained limited for much of history, the presence of schools represented an important shift in how societies organized the process of learning. Instead of relying solely on observation within daily work, certain kinds of knowledge could now be taught deliberately, within spaces dedicated to instruction. These changes gradually influenced the perception of early life within communities. When education required years of study, the early stages of life became increasingly associated with preparation rather than immediate responsibility. Individuals might spend significant time learning the skills required for future roles before entering the workforce or assuming full adult duties. This pattern was particularly visible in urban environments where economic and administrative systems depended on literacy, numeracy, and other forms of specialized knowledge. Despite these developments, the transformation remained uneven across different societies and historical periods. Many communities continued to rely primarily on traditional systems of learning through participation in family work and local traditions. Farming families, craft households, and rural communities often maintained patterns where individuals gradually assumed responsibilities through direct experience. Yet the presence of educational institutions and evolving cultural expectations signaled a broader shift within human societies. Over time, these developments contributed to the emergence of a more clearly defined stage of life devoted to learning and preparation. The idea that early life could be set aside for education and development represented a significant departure from the patterns that had shaped most of human history. As the early modern period unfolded across different regions of the world, changes in economic life, governance, and cultural expectations gradually deepened the transformation that had already begun. Societies were becoming increasingly interconnected through trade, communication, and expanding political structures. Cities continued to grow, markets linked distant regions, and institutions responsible for administration and law became more structured. Within this changing environment, the idea that individuals might spend longer periods preparing for participation in society slowly gained greater recognition. One important factor behind this shift was the growing importance of literacy and numeracy in economic and administrative life. Written records had existed for thousands of years, but in earlier periods they were often limited to small groups of scribes or religious specialists. As commercial networks expanded and governments required more detailed records of taxation, property, and trade, the ability to read, write, and calculate became useful to a wider portion of the population. These abilities required time to learn, and the process of acquiring them gradually encouraged societies to create more structured environments for instruction. Schools in various forms began to appear in many regions, often supported by religious institutions, local communities, or governing authorities. In these environments, individuals could spend extended periods learning basic literacy, arithmetic, and moral teachings considered important for participation in society. Instruction was usually guided by teachers who had already mastered these skills, allowing knowledge to be transmitted more systematically than through casual observation alone. Although access to schooling remained uneven and often limited by social status or location, the presence of these institutions represented an important development in the history of learning. At the same time, families increasingly viewed the early years of life as a period when individuals could acquire habits, knowledge, and social expectations that would shape their future roles. Parents and relatives often guided younger members of the household through a combination of practical instruction and moral education. Children might still assist with household tasks, farming, or craft production, but these activities were sometimes balanced with time devoted to learning basic reading or religious teachings. In this way, the early stages of life began to include both participation in work and deliberate preparation for the responsibilities that would come later. Cultural ideas about development also evolved during this period. Philosophers, religious leaders, and educators in several societies began reflecting on how individuals learned and how communities might guide that process more effectively. Some writings from these periods suggest that people increasingly recognized the importance of patience, guidance, and gradual instruction during the early years of life. These discussions contributed to the emergence of broader cultural conversations about education and development. Although such ideas did not transform societies overnight, they gradually influenced how communities organized the experience of growing up. The expansion of schools, the increasing value of literacy, and the evolving expectations of families all worked together to extend the time devoted to preparation before full adult responsibility. Learning became something that could occur not only through participation in daily labor, but also through structured instruction in environments designed for that purpose. These developments did not erase the older patterns of learning that had shaped most of human history, but they added a new layer to the social landscape. The path toward adulthood was beginning to include a longer period dedicated to acquiring knowledge and understanding before entering the full responsibilities of economic and civic life. As these social changes continued to unfold across different regions of the world, the idea that the early years of life could be devoted primarily to learning began to take firmer shape. The transformation was gradual and uneven, but over generations a new pattern slowly emerged. Instead of entering the full responsibilities of economic life soon after developing basic physical abilities, increasing numbers of individuals spent longer periods preparing for participation in society. This preparation involved not only practical skills but also literacy, cultural knowledge, and an understanding of the institutions that structured community life. One of the most significant forces behind this shift was the spread of formal education. Schools gradually became more common in many parts of the world, particularly in urban regions where economic and administrative systems relied heavily on written communication. Learning to read, write, and calculate required time and consistent instruction, and schools offered environments where these abilities could be practiced repeatedly under guidance. Although access to education was still far from universal in many societies, the presence of these institutions changed expectations about how knowledge could be acquired. Instead of learning entirely through observation within daily work, individuals could now spend years developing skills before assuming adult roles. Families also adapted to this changing environment. In earlier periods of history, household labor had often required the immediate participation of all capable members. As education and specialized occupations became more prominent, however, families increasingly recognized the value of allowing younger members to dedicate time to learning. Parents and relatives might still involve them in household responsibilities, but they also encouraged participation in educational activities that prepared them for future opportunities. This shift reflected a broader understanding that knowledge could open pathways to new forms of work and social mobility within expanding societies. Governments and religious institutions sometimes supported these developments by encouraging the spread of schooling and literacy. In certain regions, authorities recognized that a population capable of reading laws, maintaining records, and participating in administrative systems could strengthen the stability of the state. Religious organizations also played a role by establishing schools that taught both spiritual teachings and practical literacy. These institutions created networks through which educational practices could spread gradually across communities. Over time, these developments reshaped the cultural meaning of early life. A stage that had once been defined primarily by physical growth and gradual participation in work began to acquire a new identity centered on preparation and learning. The early years increasingly became associated with education, personal development, and the acquisition of knowledge needed to navigate the complexities of modern society. This transformation did not erase the older patterns that had shaped most of human history, but it added a new dimension to the human experience of growing up. When viewed across the vast timeline of our species, this change appears remarkably recent. For tens of thousands of years, individuals entered the responsibilities of survival through direct participation in the daily life of their communities. Only in the relatively recent past did societies begin constructing environments where the early stages of life could be devoted primarily to education and preparation. The emergence of this extended period of learning gradually gave rise to the modern understanding of childhood as a distinct stage within the human lifespan. When we step back and look across the full span of human history, an unusual pattern begins to emerge. For the overwhelming majority of time that our species has existed, human communities were organized around immediate survival within natural environments. People moved through landscapes in search of food, tended crops in small agricultural settlements, or participated in the early economies of growing towns and cities. In these worlds, learning happened through participation in daily life. Skills were absorbed gradually, while individuals accompanied others in the work that sustained the community. The idea that early life could be largely separated from these responsibilities would have been unfamiliar for most of our ancestors. Yet in the last few centuries, the structure of society has shifted in ways that have made this separation increasingly common. Industrial economies, expanding educational systems, and new cultural expectations have created environments where individuals may spend many years preparing for adult roles before fully entering them. Schools, universities, and training institutions now guide large portions of early life. Within these spaces, knowledge is transmitted through structured curricula designed to prepare individuals for participation in complex economic and social systems. This transformation has produced what might be called an evolutionary paradox. Human biology did not suddenly change within the last few centuries. The same species that once learned through direct participation in daily survival now spends long periods of early life within educational environments. The difference lies not in our biology, but in the social structures that surround us. Modern societies have created systems capable of supporting extended learning before individuals take on full economic responsibilities. This shift reflects the increasing complexity of the world that people must navigate. In earlier periods of history, mastering a relatively small set of practical skills allowed individuals to contribute to their communities. In modern societies, however, economic and technological systems often require specialized knowledge acquired through years of study. Scientific understanding, technical professions, administrative systems, and global trade networks all depend on education that extends across long periods of time. Preparing individuals to participate in these systems requires sustained learning that would have been unnecessary in earlier historical contexts. The modern concept of childhood therefore represents a cultural and institutional development rather than a timeless feature of human life. Societies gradually constructed environments that allow individuals to spend extended periods learning before assuming the responsibilities of adulthood. Families, schools, governments, and communities all contribute to maintaining these systems of preparation. The early years of life have become associated with growth, education, and exploration, rather than immediate economic contribution. When viewed against the immense background of human history, this arrangement appears remarkably recent. Our species lived for tens of thousands of years without the institutions that now define childhood. Most humans who ever lived grew up within communities where learning and responsibility unfolded together through participation in the daily tasks required for survival. The long period of protected learning that many people experience today is a product of historical change rather than biological necessity. Understanding this history reveals something important about the human story. Childhood, as it is widely recognized today, did not appear suddenly. It emerged slowly as societies developed the resources and institutions capable of supporting extended learning. The environments that now allow individuals to spend many years preparing for the future are the result of centuries of cultural, economic, and technological transformation. When historians attempt to understand the long arc of human life, One of the most striking realizations is how recently the modern experience of childhood has emerged. For most of the time that Homo sapiens has existed, communities lived under conditions where survival depended on the immediate participation of many members of the group. Knowledge about the environment, food sources, tools, and social cooperation was learned through direct experience within the routines of everyday life. The distinction between learning and working was rarely sharp, because both occurred simultaneously as individuals gradually became familiar with the tasks required to sustain their communities. In contrast, many societies today organize early life in a very different way. The early years are often dedicated primarily to learning rather than production. Schools provide structured environments where knowledge is transmitted through reading, discussion, and guided practice. Instead of observing a craft or agricultural task directly in daily work, individuals may spend long periods studying abstract knowledge that prepares them for future roles within complex economies. This change reflects a profound transformation in the social environment surrounding human development. Modern societies possess resources, technologies, and institutions capable of supporting extended periods of preparation before individuals enter the workforce. One reason this transformation became possible is the increase in productivity that accompanied agricultural intensification, technological innovation, and industrial development. As societies became capable of producing more resources than were immediately required for survival, it became feasible for some members of the population to devote significant time to education. Teachers, scholars, and institutions of learning could exist because communities were able to sustain them. Over time, this capacity allowed societies to expand educational opportunities for larger portions of the population. As education spread more widely, the early stages of life increasingly became associated with exploration, intellectual development, and the gradual acquisition of knowledge. This extended period of learning also reflects the remarkable flexibility of human culture. Human beings possess a long developmental period compared with many other species. The brain continues developing and adapting through years of experience, allowing individuals to absorb complex information about their environment and society. For most of human history, this flexibility allowed people to master the landscapes and survival strategies of their communities. In modern societies, the same capacity for extended learning now supports the acquisition of scientific knowledge, technological skills, and cultural understanding within educational institutions. Seen from this perspective, childhood in its modern form represents a cultural adaptation to the increasingly complex world that human societies have created. The time devoted to learning allows individuals to develop the abilities needed to navigate systems of technology, governance, communication, and economic exchange that would be impossible to understand quickly. Although this extended period of preparation may appear natural to those living within modern societies, it is important to remember that it represents a relatively recent chapter in the long history of our species. For most humans who have ever lived, growing up meant gradually becoming capable of participating in the work and responsibilities of the community from an early age. When we look across tens of thousands of years of human existence, the protected and education-centered stage that many people now call childhood appears less like a universal feature of human biology and more like a historical invention shaped by the development of civilization. When the long history of humanity is viewed from a distance, the idea of childhood begins to look very different from the way it is often experienced today. For most of the existence of Homo sapiens, human communities lived in environments where survival depended on the shared effort of the group. Knowledge about landscapes, seasons, animals, and plants flowed through daily participation in the activities that sustained life. Growing up meant gradually becoming familiar with these patterns while observing others and slowly contributing to the tasks required by the community. Learning and responsibility unfolded together rather than being separated into distinct phases of life. Over thousands of generations, this rhythm shaped how human beings understood development. The transition from early life toward adulthood was usually a gradual process guided by experience rather than by formal stages defined by institutions. A person who became capable of performing certain tasks slowly took part in those activities, gaining confidence and understanding over time. There was rarely a clear boundary that separated childhood from adulthood, because learning happened continuously through involvement in the life of the group. Only in relatively recent centuries did a different pattern begin to take hold in many societies. The growth of cities, the expansion of education, and the increasing complexity of economic and technological systems created environments where individuals often needed years of preparation before fully entering adult responsibilities. Schools, training institutions, and universities gradually became places where knowledge could be transmitted in structured ways. These institutions made it possible for many people to spend long periods studying before participating directly in the systems that support modern society. From a historical perspective, this transformation represents a remarkable cultural development. It reflects the ability of human societies to reshape the conditions of development according to the needs of their time. Modern childhood, with its extended years of learning and exploration, exists because communities have created the resources and institutions capable of supporting it. Families, teachers, and social systems work together to provide time for intellectual growth before the full responsibilities of adult life begin. Yet the deeper history of our species quietly reminds us that this stage of life is not universal across time. Most humans who ever lived did not grow up in environments defined by classrooms, textbooks, or long periods devoted exclusively to study. Their learning happened through participation in the landscapes, communities, and survival systems that surrounded them. Understanding this contrast does not diminish the value of modern childhood. Instead, it reveals how unusual and valuable it truly is. The opportunity to spend years learning, exploring ideas, and preparing for the future is the result of centuries of social and cultural development. It represents a collective achievement made possible by the stability and cooperation of human societies. Seen in this light, childhood can be understood as one of the quiet successes of civilization. It is a space created by communities so that the next generation can develop knowledge, imagination, and understanding before stepping into the responsibilities that sustain society. When we remember that most of human history unfolded without this stage, the meaning of childhood becomes clearer. It is not simply a biological phase of life, but a social promise made by one generation to the next. And perhaps that leads to a final quiet reflection. If childhood is something humanity slowly learned to create, then the way we protect and nurture it may reveal how we choose to shape the future of our species.